Italian Billionaire's Unexpected Lover. The Romano Brothers series, Book 2. Written by Leslie North. Performed by Connor Brown. 1. Luciana. No, 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 Luciana Vivaldi murmured as she took in the text message on her phone. Daycare. Nathalia had another nightmare during nap time, and a parent reported their child cried last night, afraid to go to bed. Please come right away to meet with the director. No, Luciana whispered to the sky as she squeezed her eyes shut and held the phone against her chest. The message had been coded for, get a new daycare. It would be the third daycare her niece had been asked to leave in less than a month, and it meant begging off a job Luciana had only just started in order to leave early. She didn't know how she would manage it. Luciana, a man's voice called, tearing her attention away from the message. It was the voice of her new boss, Gianpierre, one of the 3 Romano brothers who had inherited the broken-down Romano del Mare resort. He was a world-renowned structural engineer, specializing in the restoration of medieval structures like this one. For the millionth time since she'd come to Sicily a month and a half ago, Luciana wished she could ask her sister, Natalia's mother Sophia, how to take care of her new young charge while also holding down a job. But unless she was willing to suspend all the beliefs of her Catholic upbringing and hold a seance, that wasn't going to happen. Her sister was gone. Natalia's mother was gone. In a heartbreaking instant, Luciana had gone from the distant aunt and godmother to brand new mother of a 5-year-old little girl. It was a role she had not been ready to take on, but whoever was. Will the bricks be delivered on time, Luciana? Gianpierre demanded, his impatience showing itself more than usual today. Wearing a sleeveless white cotton tee above jeans that had given up the fight to hold their own form and instead showed off every curve of Gianpierre's muscular body, the man stood with his powerful arm propped on top of a shovel's upright handle. Worn and weathered boots that probably still carried the dust of Prague, Austria, and Romania clad his feet, and the gloves he wore on his hands were sure to have worked to restore medieval buildings in more countries than Luciana had ever visited. He has to have competed, Luciana thought to herself, as she did her best to ignore Gianpierre's stage-ready weightlifter body. She was long-legged and slender, but being around Gianpierre made her feel soft and flabby. She enjoyed a long jog infinitely more than lifting anything heavier than a bag of sugar, and she did love sugar. She suspected that Gianpierre had never let a morsel of the sweet stuff pass those beautiful kissable lips of his to mar the perfect temple of his body. Luciana said, tucking her phone into the pocket of her khakis before fumbling with her tablet to check the schedule of deliveries. She'd been distracted today. Adding to the issue of finding Nathalia a new daycare was the fact that she'd missed another house showing and had had to reschedule for a second time. And all the while, little Nathalia's nightmares were getting worse. The little girl needed a new space where she could focus on the joy of making new memories rather than the pain of old memories that held her trapped in a constant state of mourning. Luciana, Gianpierre chided in a way that made her name sound like music on his lips. We need those bricks. I need those bricks. They can't come from just anywhere. They have to match perfectly. Buildings like this cannot be restored with the materials of today. They need to be created with the same processes in order to have the same look, the same texture. Yes, sir, Luciana said, walking toward him with her head down as she flipped through the screens of her tablet to find the information she needed. She'd only had this job for 2 weeks. Gianpierre's previous project manager had quit to manage celebrity parties. It had left Gianpierre in the lurch, but it had been the perfect opportunity for Luciana. She needed this job. Really needed it. Burying her sister had been expensive, and raising her sister's daughter was proving to be even more expensive. Ah, Luciana said, walking with her nose still down and her eyes focused on her tablet. Luciana. They will be here the day after tomorrow. Luciana. They need an additional day to cure. Luciana. Luciana stopped in her tracks to find Gianpierre standing right in front of her, with his work-roughened hand on her bare arm. He'd had taken off his gloves, and the heat of his skin on hers made her heart quicken. Then, when she looked up into his ice-blue eyes, that were made more startling by being framed by his sun-tanned skin, her breath moved high into her chest, as if to swell her heart with longing. The change made her breasts rise and fall, as if in invitation for him to look at them. Gianpierre's gaze flicked down for just a second, but a second was all it took. Luciana's cheeks flooded with heat. The effect that Gianpierre had on her was like pouring water onto a gas flame. His presence amplified her every sensation to explosive levels that she struggled to contain. I shouldn't feel this way. Sophia's dead. Life isn't about my wants anymore. She had her niece to think about now. She couldn't jeopardize her job by getting involved with her boss no matter how much she craved him. Guilt sat heavy in Luciana's heart that she was alive and her sister wasn't, even though it had meant the end of Luciana's life as well, or rather, life as she had known it. In a literal heartbeat, she'd gone from being a visitor in Sicily to a new resident. She'd quit her job in America by email and put her house on the market. A neighbor shipped some of her belongings to her, then sold the rest and sent her the money. That money, plus her small savings, had come in handy to tide her and Nathalia over, but it was running out fast. Too fast. Luciana, walk with your eyes as well as your feet, Gianpierre gently chided as he guided her to step a little to the side. She'd been about to walk into the yellow hazard tape that encircled a sunken section of the Romano del Mare's inner courtyard. The spot was 3 feet across and about 6 inches deep. It wasn't very impressive to look at, but it spoke volumes about the state of the tunnels beneath the medieval monastery-turned-resort. There were miles of tunnels under there, and some of them had not seen a stonemason's chisel since the days of their construction over 870 years ago. Luciana fumbled. Sorry, sir. Thank you, sir. What is this, sir? The big man's stern expression transformed into a bright smile. You Americans, so formal. Call me Gianpierre. As one of the 3 sons of the Romano family, inheritor of the Romano billions, and equal owner of the now-defunct Romano del Mare resort, Gianpierre didn't make Luciana nervous. He terrified her. She'd fudged her curriculum vitae, the European version of a resume, more than a little bit to appear more qualified for the job. Back in the U.S., she'd been the lead buyer for a large construction company. She'd overseen the material timeline and the needs of dozens of simultaneous construction projects. She had not considered that operating as the project manager on one single project would be very challenging, but it was. She was in a new area of the world, dealing with language and cultural barriers and specialty materials that were designed to match those made nearly 1,000 years ago. It was hard, yet the hardest thing for Luciana at the moment was not stretching up on her tippy toes and leaning in to kiss Gianpierre's luscious lips. Why do I want him? She lamented. Her life was upside down, yet all she could think about every time she got near Gianpierre was how good he smelled. She wanted to lose herself in him. She wanted to forget how hard life was now that everything had changed. Sorry, sir. She took a breath. Gianpierre. She'd meant to say his name as a correction to almost having called him sir again, but it came out like a whisper in the dark between lovers. The heat in her cheeks deepened, and Luciana looked away and then stepped away, putting distance between them. Gianpierre said, turning his back on her without seeming to notice her reaction to him. He returned to where he had been originally standing, next to another section that had been taped off with hazard tape. Look here. The stone that we get will need to be weathered, or it will not blend in with the surrounding cobbles for at least a century. Would you like me to obtain a report of the stone's history, sir? She cut herself off, and did not try to correct herself this time. No, he said, waving a hand in sharp dismissal. It will work or it won't. We will know when the shipment comes. With her attention back on her tablet, Luciana stepped forward, and the ground beneath her moved. The world slipped, and Luciana fell through. 2. Gianpierre. Gianpierre heard Luciana's scream, and his head whipped around. The heavy carved stone bricks beneath her feet had given way to a cave-in within the tunnels below, and she was falling. She could be crushed and killed if she reached the bottom before the heavy stones, and if she reached the bottom after them, she could easily fall upon the rubble and break her back or crack her head. Gianpierre released the trowel in his hand and let it fall forgotten to the ground as he lunged for Luciana. He dove low and caught her around her ribs as she fell through the earth, then he rolled with her. The motion pulled her out of the hole mid-fall and moved them both away from the crumbling surface. He'd done what he'd had to do to save her life, but what he no longer had to do was hold her as he was. Her long body was under him, and he encased her in his arms, sheltering her with his head and shoulders as if to protect her from a falling sky. Se ti fosse successo qualcosa. The words, if something had happened to you, tumbled off Gianpierre's tongue, but he was sure that the American beauty in his arms didn't comprehend. She had only worked for him a couple of weeks, but he could tell already that it had been 2 weeks too long. He had to get rid of her. She'd been nothing but a distraction since the day she'd started. As gently as Gianpierre could, he brushed Luciana's silky brown hair from her forehead and said, "Sei licenziato," before repeating in English, "You're fired." Luciana's eyes went as wide and as round as saucers before her pianist hands pushed hard against his chest in an attempt to throw him off. "No, no, 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 no! I need this job!" She got to her feet and gave no indication that she had noticed the huge tear down one leg of her khakis, or the way her usually loose top was twisted and pulled tight to show off her normally camouflaged curves. Luciana was stunning. She was a beauty that could grace the cover of any Italian magazine, and it had been a daily struggle for Gianpierre to stay focused on his work instead of her intoxicating presence. He wasn't the one who had hired her. He wouldn't have hired her. That had been done by his departing project manager before he'd left. No, Luciana was a distraction Gianpierre didn't need. He was racing the clock on a career-defining opportunity that could have him gracing the cover of Architectural Digest. He didn't care if his decision to fire her was sexist. He couldn't have her here messing with his head, and he couldn't have her here getting hurt. He wouldn't risk it. He would shut down the whole operation before he allowed it. "Sir, Gianpierre, I need this job," Luciana said, as she held him in place by wrapping her delicate hands around his bicep. Her touch was light, yet she held him captive. "I didn't do anything wrong. It was the ground. I wasn't in the taped-off area. It wasn't my fault. Sir, my sister, my niece." Gianpierre wanted to shrug himself free of her grip. He wanted to turn his back on her and wave her off as he walked away. But he didn't. "Then go home to your sister. Go home to your niece." Luciana's expression transformed into stunned shock. She looked as though he had physically struck her, and her grip fell away, leaving him to instantly miss her touch. The murmur of his other workers and their awkward looks and shuffling had Gianpierre throwing his arms down as he exclaimed, "What?" His attention refocused on Luciana, and what he saw stopped him cold. Her once clear eyes had turned bloodshot, though no tears were pooling. "What?" Gianpierre asked again, this time with a gentle voice and a fearful heart. "My sister died a month and a half ago," Luciana answered. "On her way to pick me up from the airport. I'm raising her daughter." Gianpierre looked back and forth between Luciana and his crew before exclaiming, "Why has no one told me?" Then to Luciana he said without looking, "You stay." He continued to silently fume as he shoved his hands back into his gloves. When he spoke again, he was calmer, although the anger was still there. "Here," he pointed to the ground. "This is no place for you. This is no place for a woman." Luciana's gaze shifted over to the 3 women who were on his medieval reconstruction crew before looking back at Gianpierre. Despite the dust on their faces and the work-worn clothes that adorned their bodies, they were definitely women. In fact, they were beautiful women. "They don't count," Gianpierre said dismissively, flipping a hand into the air. "They go where I go. They don't count. This job, it's here today and gone tomorrow for you. It's not your life. I don't want you dying for it. It's too dangerous. You don't belong here." To his surprise, Luciana took a deep breath, squared her shoulders, and stepped closer until her body was only inches away from his. There was nowhere else for Gianpierre to look except at her painfully beautiful face. It physically hurt him to look at her and not touch her. The only reason he'd put his gloves back on was to keep from caressing her porcelain skin. Her cheeks were high and her lips were full, and every time he saw her, all he could think about was having her under him. He wanted to hear his name on her lips in those few sweet moments of life when everything else ceased to matter. "I do deserve to be here," Luciana declared. "I deserve to be here as much as any man." "Man, woman, I don't care about these things," Gianpierre countered, but his declared stance lacked the support of his actions. In truth, he didn't care about the gender of the person working for him. He cared about results. It was all about the results. And the results he needed right now was for the reconstruction work at the Romano del Mare to be completed as soon as possible so that he could move on to his next job. He'd been offered a position in Dubai, and the window of that opportunity was closing with every tick of the clock's hands. When that job went, so did his opportunity to be on the cover of Architectural Digest. Luciana's presence was a siren's wail to his focus, and it put all his plans in jeopardy. He couldn't have her here. God was having a fine joke to tease him with a precious gift he couldn't bear to accept. "It is my life, sir," Luciana countered, her expression as hard as steel. "Forgive me." He wanted to tell her that he didn't care if he was right or wrong. But he didn't. "It is not my place to decide the lives of others." Then Gianpierre stepped closer, so that with every breath she took, the crest of Luciana's breasts came within a hair's width of touching his chest. He stared down into her green eyes and willed himself not to dip his head to take her lips with his own. "This is your job. You have done well, and you have earned the right to stay. I worry." His gaze flicked to her full lips before returning to her eyes. "I would not do well if harm came to you. The fall. It scared me." Luciana sucked in air in reaction to the naked truth of Gianpierre's words. Looking to the side, she stepped away, putting distance between them and breaking the intimacy of their closeness. With anyone else, it was a line that Gianpierre would not have crossed. But he'd seen the way she looked at him. He'd seen how she wanted him. Take her, then discard her. Get her out of your blood. It wasn't a new thought, yet there had been a sadness about her that had kept him away. Even before the accident they'd just faced, he had felt that it was as if the world had shifted under her feet and she was hanging on by only the tips of her fingers. She'd seemed too fragile for him to trifle with for the sake of scratching his own itch. Now he knew why. "Will you—" "I have to go," Luciana said, cutting him off as she looked down at her watch. "The daycare texted. They're not happy with Nathalia. I need to go pick her up." Gianpierre had been about to ask Luciana to have dinner with him, but her words saved him. "They are not happy with her?" Luciana nodded, continuing to inch further away from him. "It's the nightmares. She has nightmares. It scares the other children." "Luciana, it's okay, though. I'll go straight there. I'll get her, leave her with a neighbor, and be back here in under an hour. Luciana. And I'll work late to make up the time. Luciana!" She stopped, her expression fearful of what Gianpierre would utter next. "You're bleeding." "What?" "Your leg. It's scraped." Luciana bent and twisted. It seemed to be the first time she'd noticed that her pants were tore up the side of one thigh. The long red scrapes caused by the fall had begun to weep. It wasn't anything that a wash and a little ointment couldn't take care of, but it might be scary for others to see, especially little children. "Take the rest of the day off, Luciana. Take care of you and your family." "Take the rest of the day off? But your schedule?" No, Gianpierre said. "Take tomorrow off as well." He bit back the words, telling her to take forever off, to never come back, and to leave him alone, so that he could get his work done without being constantly plagued with thoughts of her nearness. Luciana took a step forward, and Gianpierre saw the panic in her eyes. Sir, my job. 3. Gianpierre. I am saying sorry, Gianpierre said, putting a hand over his heart. Take off today. Take off tomorrow. Take care of your familia. I will see you Friday when you come back to your job. At least it would give him a small respite from her. Luciana took a breath as if she was getting ready to lob an objection, but then she simply gave a curt nod of acceptance. That will help, sir. Gianpierre, thank you. She offered up the weakest smile he'd ever gotten from her before she turned to make her way from the Romano del Mare's enormous inner courtyard. Her first steps included a limp, but it disappeared after only a moment through what Gianpierre assumed was force of will. Luciana's strength reminded Gianpierre of his grandmother. She'd been a formidable woman, tough as nails, but as kind and gentle as a lamb. Gianpierre turned his attention to his crew. Bernardo, Carmine, tape off the new hole and do what you can to clean up this area so that reconstruction can continue tomorrow. Everyone else, make a line and tap every inch of this courtyard. Look for spots ready to cave and tape them off. Then, make a map of the courtyard and mark the spots. Overlay it with a map of the tunnels and mark the spots that still need to be checked. Paolo, you're with me in the tunnels. If you do not hear from us in an hour, someone come check on us. Si, capo, chorused the people of Gianpierre's loyal crew, telling him, yes, boss. They'd been with him for years and had followed him to the most remote locations on Earth. Being back home in Sicily was a treat for everyone, except Gianpierre. That wasn't exactly true. Gianpierre loved being back in Italy, and Sicily especially. It was his home. It was his heart. His heritage was in Sicily. It held his past, and it was his future. But it was not where he wanted to be right now. He wasn't ready to settle down and make the medieval architecture of Italy his consuming passion. There was still the whole world to see and travel. There were still ruins to explore and save, ruins with history different than the ruins of Italy. He wasn't ready for Sicily to become his everything. Not yet. 6 hours later, a tired and dirty Gianpierre and Paolo emerged from the snaking tunnels beneath the Romano del Mare. Ciao, everybody. Go to your families. See you tomorrow, he said, releasing his crew for the night. They had done a good job, and he wouldn't risk wearing out their goodwill by working them so hard that they missed out on spending time with family they had barely seen in months. Send me all pictures of problem spots within the next couple of hours. He'd go over them later. Just because their day of work had ended didn't mean his had. Collecting the rolls of plans and notes made by his crew, he headed for home, or rather home base. It was an apartment that he'd been renting for years in the nearby town. It was the top level, floor-through of a 4-story building that gave him exclusive use of the roof, which he'd converted for use as a gym. When he'd rented the place years ago, he'd only meant to keep it for 6 months. But 6 months had somehow turned into over 10 years. It was the closest thing to a home that he had, even if he was only there at most 2 months out of the year. Running up the building's stairs instead of taking the elevator, Gianpierre let himself in through the door that he never bothered to lock whenever he was in town. The day's sweat had mingled with centuries-old dust, leaving him feeling grimy. Pulling the strap of his scarred and beaten leather courier bag over his head and leaving it on the floor, Gianpierre kicked off his boots next to the door so as not to track the work site's ancient dirt through his apartment. Next, he stripped off his clothes and left them in a pile before walking through the apartment naked to the shower. The hot water from the shower streamed over his head and temporarily turned the swirling water at his feet gray as his body let go of the last of the day's grime. Turning around, he let the water pound the tired muscles of his back. He had traced every passage archway of the resort's catacombs and had even discovered a long-ago caved-in section that required extensive excavation and structural repair. The discovery would push his schedule back by weeks, if not months, and it was time he couldn't spare. Turning off the water, Gianpierre dried himself before tossing the towel over his hair. Rubbing it as he walked, he headed to his bedroom, passing the apartment's entryway as he went. A woman's gasp made him freeze, and then turn as he dropped the towel from his head to drape across his broad shoulders. There, in front of a still-open door, stood a tall, slender woman with large round eyes and a mouth that was open in shock. Luciana? Luciana. Luciana had come to the apartment, but was getting an eyeful of so much more. Gianpierre whipped the towel from around his broad, muscular shoulders and made hasty work of wrapping it around his tight waist. Behind her, Luciana heard the real estate agent enter, and she knew that little Nathalia would be with her. "Sir?" Luciana whispered. It was an apology and question all in one. Behind her, Signora Rizzo gasped, and Luciana turned around just in time to see the old woman slip her hand over Natalia's eyes. "What is this?" Gianpierre demanded. His still damp body glistened, his layers of muscles begging to be traced by Luciana's hands. Luciana said, shaking her head. She didn't know what to say, and she gave Signora Rizzo an imploring look. "Signore Romano, this apartment is for sale." "What?" Gianpierre said, taking a threatening step forward, with his shoulders bunched, as if ready to fight Poseidon himself. "We contacted you. Letters have been sent for 6 months with no response. We had no choice but to move forward. The building has new owners, and instead of offering rentals, they're offering the apartments for sale. I am sorry, signore. I did not know that you were in town." Through it all, she kept her hands over Natalia's eyes, even though the little girl squirmed and pulled at the woman's hands. "You are selling my home?" Signora Rizzo shrugged. "Would you like to buy it?" Luciana watched, amazed, as Gianpierre took a step back with the same sudden intensity that he had taken a step forward. His eyes darted from place to place within the space that he called home, and Luciana was sure that she saw panic in his eyes. "Signore Romano?" the real estate agent prompted again. No. I'm only renting. This is a temporary home. I'm not settling down. I travel too much to own. It makes no sense." "It makes no sense to rent for 10 years. As part of the sales pitch, Signora Rizzo had told Luciana how long the current tenant had lived in the apartment. It was a sign of satisfaction with the location. Luciana had had no idea at all that the tenant was Gianpierre Romano, her boss, whom she had now seen naked. And oh, what a sight it had been. "I'm sorry," Luciana said. "I'm so sorry. We'll go." She turned to leave, but Signora Rizzo leaned a shoulder into her path. "You do not even want to see the place? It is beautiful." Luciana looked behind her, but found Gianpierre gone. "I should go," she shrugged. "I can't even afford this place. I don't know what I was thinking." "But you could, if you sell." She paused, and her eyes saddened. When she continued, she spoke as if she were choosing her words carefully. "If you sell your sister's place and your place in America, then use the money as a down payment, your monthly mortgage will only be a little bit more than your budget allows." She shrugged. "It is a big place, 3 bedrooms. Maybe if you take a tenant, the cost will become easy for you." Luciana looked around her. The floors were a rich, dark hardwood with a red tint, and the walls were painted a creamy white. The arched doors were wide, and the layout was spacious. Everything about it had an old-world charm, but also the clean lines of a modern space with all of the modern comforts. And, of course, the fact that it was Gianpierre's became clear as she took in its decor. On the walls were displayed a variety of antique medieval stone masonry tools. Rare world maps from varying eras canvassed another wall, and circular tubes, the kind that held blueprints and building plans, were leaning in groups in every available corner. This was Gianpierre's home. "It even has exclusive access to the roof," Signora Rizzo whispered, as if sharing a secret. "You could have a garden up there." A garden? Luciana's eyes shifted to the ceiling, as if she could look through it to what was above, and found herself nodding before she even spoke. Yes, I'd like to see it." Gianpierre reappeared from a side hallway. His tousled hair was no longer dripping wet. He was barefoot and dressed in old jeans that were threadbare at the knees, and his shirt could have been worn by a pirate. It was white cotton with an open V-neck. It made it impossible for Luciana to look anywhere but at the rising slope and carved valley of Gianpierre's pecs. His sun-kissed skin made her lips tingle with the need to kiss him. Forcing her brain to think, Luciana amended her previous statement. I'd like to see it, if it's okay with Signore Romano. She chose not to use his first name. The real estate agent was still blissfully unaware of the situation that she had thrown Luciana into, and Luciana was happy to keep it that way. There was no need to add to the discomfort that the awkward situation had already created. The color was high in Gianpierre's face, a vein popping at his temple. He slapped his thigh and ran a hand through his hair, clearly agitated. Luciana was sure he was going to throw them out, but to her complete surprise he said, "Sure, I will show you myself." She hesitated. "The man almost barred me today, and now I've barged my way into his home? I should leave." "Please, come," he said, waving them forward. "Over here is the dining room." He motioned to the side of the entryway where a table sat. It was covered with work paraphernalia, but beneath that it looked to be crafted out of huge wood beams sometimes found along the ceilings of old structures. Reaching for Natalia's hand, Luciana moved deeper into the apartment as Signora Rizzo trailed behind. "And through here is the kitchen." To call it a kitchen felt like an understatement. It had a cathedral ceiling, and the appliances looked as though they belonged in a chef's kitchen. They all gleamed of shiny stainless steel, but the refrigerator had a cabinet front on it that made it disappear into the wall. Luciana swallowed nervously. Replacing the kitchen appliances would be expensive, but there was no way Gianpierre would leave such high-end items behind. Gianpierre tapped his finger against a pot hanging down from the corner of the stove's hood. "I cook while I'm here, but I'm not here often, so the stove and the rest have not seen much use. They will remain good for years." "What? You plan to leave the appliances?" Gianpierre shrugged. "I have nowhere else to put them. They were bought for this space." Luciana shot Signora Rizzo a worried glance as she wondered how much the high-end appliances would increase the cost of the apartment. But if Gianpierre bought them, maybe it won't increase the cost any. Signora Rizzo's quick note scribbling didn't leave her with much hope of that, though. "I have a gym on the roof, and I had a pool installed." Luciana's mouth fell open. "There is a pool up there?" Signora Rizzo exclaimed. Gianpierre shrugged again. "The former owner said it was fine." Signora Rizzo scratched furious notes in her pad, and Luciana could practically hear the sound of a cash register chiming. He made all of these upgrades to a place that he was renting? The price was going to be too much now, and she knew that she should just leave. But she didn't. Gianpierre continued his tour, and they followed along. He showed them the bedrooms next. They were spacious and well lit, with a stunning view of the bay. Then there was the family room, his office, a gorgeous bathroom, and finally a balcony. When she stepped outside, a soft breeze blowing in from over the water swept Luciana's hair this way and that around her face. "This is where I like to have breakfast," Gianpierre said, as he pulled a free strand of hair that had wrapped itself around her neck and brushed it over her shoulder. His touch made Luciana shiver, but it seemed to mean nothing to him. Tearing her gaze away from Gianpierre, Luciana took in her surroundings and drew in a deep breath as she fought tears. It was beautiful. It was tranquil. The ocean was a brilliant blue in front of them, and the building's height and location provided a bird's-eye view of the small, quiet town as it sloped down toward the water's edge. Then Luciana noticed the noise, or rather the lack of noise. There was a distant sound of traffic, but it was very distant, since mostly people walked in town. An occasional sound of laughter reached her ears. "It's so peaceful," Luciana said, then picked Nathalia up so that the little girl was propped on her hip. Through the entire tour, Nathalia hadn't said a peep. She'd been quiet as a mouse and had watched Gianpierre with her large round eyes rather than taking the home. "What do you think, sweetie? Do you think you would like living here?" The little girl took so long to speak that Luciana almost gave up on her saying anything. "Matri liked our home," the little girl finally said as she wound her hand into Luciana's hair. "She did," Luciana said, smiling as she gave the little girl's belly a rub. "Do you remember what else she liked?" The little girl shook her head no. She liked the ocean. She loved to look at it. Do you think she would like the view from this balcony? The little girl's gaze shifted to the ocean, and she seemed to study it. Then, looking back at Luciana, Nathalia nodded her head enthusiastically. Do you think she would like it if you got to look at the ocean for her? Nathalia nodded again, and then returned her gaze to the ocean before laying her head on Luciana's shoulder. Luciana turned to Signora Rizzo. In a quiet, soft voice, she said, "We'll take it." 4. Gianpierre. "You sure you don't want me to stay, Capo?" Paolo asked. No, Gianpierre answered, though he cast a worried eye toward the darkening sky. A heavy storm was rolling in from the ocean. "Your niece is having her birthday party tonight, yes? You go, I've got these." There was only a little bit of work to do, and then Gianpierre would be able to call it a night as well. Paolo clapped Gianpierre on the shoulder. "Si, Capo. Grazie." Then, with a wave over his shoulder, he jogged out of the large courtyard. He didn't make it all the way out before having to stop and talk to a matronly woman on her way in, though. Gianpierre squinted in an effort to discern who the woman was as Paolo pointed a long arm in his direction, but her features were lost to him in the failing light. He watched as Paolo turned and left, rushing to beat the coming rain. In contrast, the woman Paolo had spoken to marched toward Gianpierre without any concern at all for the brewing storm. As she neared, Gianpierre finally recognized her. "Buonasera, Signora Rizzo," Gianpierre greeted her, wishing her a good evening. He didn't ask her what her business was, trusting that she would get to it when she was ready. It had been 3 days since the unexpected showing of his apartment, and he hadn't heard anything else. He didn't have a moving date, and he hadn't even started packing. As for him and Luciana, she'd only been back to work 1 day, but it had been a very long day while they'd both avoided talking of the incident. "Buonasera," Signora Rizzo said, brushing her short, wind-whipped hair behind her ear. "Is this an okay time to talk, Signore Romano?" Gianpierre glanced at the sky, but if she was willing to talk to him in the growing, nearly gale-force winds, then he was willing to listen. Shrugging, he said, "Si, Signora. Should we go inside out of the weather?" Signora Rizzo leaned so that she could see around Gianpierre and peered at the taped-off hole behind him. To the side sat a tarp. Even though it was anchored under heavy stones, its unweighted edges flapped wildly in the wind. Without the tarp, the catacombs below would be in danger of becoming flooded by the coming rain. "I'm interrupting your work. Let me help you as we talk." Gianpierre took a breath in preparation to refuse her generous offer, but he held his tongue when Signora Rizzo moved past him. Without waiting for a response, she put her large purse on the ground and set to work moving the large stones off the tarp so that the tarp could be moved. The fact that she was wearing high heels, a tweed skirt, and snug dress jacket didn't deter her at all. Gianpierre jumped in to assist, and soon they were fighting with the airborne tarp as they maneuvered it over the hole. Signora Rizzo did an admirable job of holding it in place as Gianpierre made fast work of putting the anchoring stones back around its edges. Once that was done, he finished the job by sliding an angled rod beneath the tarp. The point of the rod tented the tarp upward so that the water would cascade off rather than making a pool of water that would eventually dump the tarp and all its contents inside the belly of the catacombs beneath. Fat raindrops began to fall just as Gianpierre was finishing wedging the tenting rod between 2 rocks. Getting to his feet, he grabbed Signora Rizzo's purse and hurried them both to stand under the covered walkway that surrounded the entire courtyard. Signora Rizzo's gaze scanned the 16-foot-high stone archways, and her eyes crinkled at their corners as a smile pulled at her lips. "I always loved old places like this," she said, reaching out a hand to trace the face of the nearest stone pillar. "I am so happy that you and your brothers are restoring the Romano del Mare rather than letting her crumble." Gianpierre studied Signora Rizzo's rapturous expression. It means so much to her. He had taken the Romano del Mare for granted. It had always been a part of his life, tucked away in the background. Over the years, it had become more of an afterthought than anything of importance, but he realized, for the people who called Sicily their home, the Romano del Mare mattered. A lot. Seeing Signora Rizzo's adoring gaze as she felt the ancient stones that made up the medieval one-time monastery was a humbling reminder to him that the brothers' decision impacted lives far, far beyond just their own, and the work that they did to restore the Romano del Mare was a service to the entire region. "Seeing how you look at her, I am happy as well," he said. Signora Rizzo turned her smile on Gianpierre, but then her eyes dimmed and her body stiffened as she transitioned into business mode. "Signore Romano, I understand now, with your many months of travel, that you did not receive notice that the building's new owners are moving to an owner's model rather than a rental model. I am here to formally ask you if you would like to purchase the home that you have been renting. As you know, you have poured a lot of equity into the home with the various updates and the installation of a pool on the roof. It is equity that will be completely lost if you do not purchase the home for yourself. Even if you decide to later sell it, you will at least regain the value that you have already put into it." "I don't understand. Luciana, the woman you brought to view the property, has committed to purchase it." Signora Rizzo flattened her lips and shook her head in a slow, sad no. "The bank refused her loan. I had to tell her today. She's not approved for the purchase." "They refused? Why?" Signora Rizzo shrugged and bobbed her head from side to side as if contemplating how much she should say. Giving in, she answered, "I called the bank to see if I could smooth things over, but they said that she's lived here for too short a time and that she's only been employed for 2 weeks. On top of that, the bank understands that her employment only continues for as long as your work continues. They consider her too much of a risk. In addition to that, buying your place is going to be a financial stretch for her anyway." Signora Rizzo squared her shoulders. "So, Signore Romano, would you like to buy the apartment? It has been your home for over 10 years, after all." No. It has been my home base, not my home. It is simply the place that I come back to. It is not the place I live. I live wherever the work takes me, and the work seldom takes me here. I am due in Dubai right now." "And yet you've continued to hold on to this apartment for 10 years. "But it was always temporary. It's a rental, nothing more," Gianpierre said, throwing down his hands in emphasis. "I have too many opportunities pulling me away to other countries. I cannot be tied down to Sicily right now. It's not time yet." "Si, signore, si," Signora Rizzo said in acceptance of his words. Gianpierre's voice and stance softened. "What will become of Luciana and the little girl? Did Luciana get approved for enough to find another place she would like?" Signora Rizzo pursed her lips and shook her head, tisking. She said, "No, signore. The bank would not approve her for any loan. She is too new, and her work history here is too short." She shook her head some more. "It is so sad. The little girl has terrible nightmares, and Luciana sometimes finds her searching the house in the middle of the night. When she asks the little girl what she is looking for, the little girl tells her she saw her madre in her dreams and she's looking for her. It's why Luciana wants to find them a new home. She's hoping it will help the little girl recover from watching her mother die." "She saw her madre die?" Gianpierre's mind reeled. He imagined himself experiencing something so tragic when he had been her age, but it was unfathomable. Si. Little Nathalia was in the car with her when they were hit by a huge truck. It twisted the car and then—" She tisked some more as she stared out into the heavy rain. "How long was she in the car with her after her madre died?" He didn't want to know the answer, but his mind demanded the terrible truth. Signora Rizzo lifted her haunted eyes to meet his. "An hour, maybe. She was trapped. They had to cut the car open. It took time for the equipment to reach them." Gianpierre put his face in his hand and leaned back against the pillar. His problems were becoming smaller and smaller in comparison to the rest of the world's, but this was one problem that he could do something about. Dropping his hand, he said, "And you have already told Luciana that she has been denied a loan by the bank?" "Si, signore." "Call on her tonight and tell her that you've gotten word from the bank that there was a mistake and that they will be approving her loan. Tell her it is enough to cover the purchase of my home. My apartment," he corrected, unwilling to refer to a place where he lived almost 2 months a year as his home. "Signore?" "I will call the bank tomorrow and will tell them that I will back the loan. But Luciana is not to know that. Senora Rizzo smiled brightly and gave Gianpierre an approving pat on the arm. Si, signore. 5. Luciana. Si, signore, I'll hold, Luciana said with her cell phone pressed to her ear. She nudged her sunglasses up her nose. She didn't need them on such an overcast day, but she'd spent the last hour fighting tears. Senora Rizzo had visited her at her home last night to tell her that the bank had approved the loan after all. But when Luciana had called the bank as soon as it had opened this morning to confirm that it was true, the bank had told her no. She was still denied the loan. Any loan. Now she was back to square one of trying to figure out how to provide Nathalia with a home that she could find happiness in. Signorina Vivaldi, I am sorry to make you wait. I am Signore Glordano, the bank presidente, said the reassuring, patient voice of what sounded like an older gentleman. Luciana tried to hide a sniffle. It's no problem, signore. She couldn't imagine what else they had to tell her. How many times did she need to be told that they didn't deem her a good financial risk? There has been a mistake. It's okay. They've already told me that I don't qualify for a loan. But that is the mistake. You have been approved for the original loan amounts that you requested. What? Luciana couldn't believe her ears. My sincerest apologies, signorina. There was a mistake, but your line of credit has now been approved. New tears flooded Luciana's eyes, but this time they were tears of joy. Come in later this afternoon and we will finalize the paperwork. I've given instructions for you to be directed to my office, and I look forward to seeing you. Luciana's heart skipped a beat. This afternoon? The bank would be closed by the time she got off work. Gianpierre had been pushing them into longer and longer hours. I'm not sure that I can get away from work. This evening, then. Whatever time works for you, I will send you a text of my personal mobile number. Let me know that you are on your way, and I will meet you here. No time is too late. Luciana pulled the phone away from her ear and stared at it in disbelief. Possibly it was a cultural difference between Sicily and America, but she had never had a bank official be so nice to her. Si, signore. Grazie, grazie. Clicking off the call, Luciana jumped up and down in place and then did a little dance. Gianpierre's crew watched her and laughed, but it was in good humor with camaraderie. We can get Gianpierre's place, Luciana exclaimed unintelligibly in a muted squeal. It was loud enough to give her glee some place to go, while not being so loud as to telecast her business to everyone within hearing distance. As far as she knew, none of Gianpierre's regular crew knew what had happened between them. They didn't know that she was trying to buy his home, and they sure as heck didn't know that she had walked in on him while he was naked. To be honest, Gianpierre had barely spoken 10 words to her since that night. She'd taken the next day off, per Gianpierre's direction, and then had returned to work the day after as usual. She'd tried to talk to him about the incident twice, but each time he would bark out an order to someone on his crew, and then would be off to investigate some new corner of the catacombs. This time, though, Luciana had news about the catacombs herself. One of the workers had found yet another room that had been filled with dirt. Its structural integrity was unknown, and its contents were unknown. Where is he? Luciana said aloud as she scanned the courtyard. Gianpierre was traditionally the first one on site and the last one to leave, but today he was late. Michela, she called out, flagging down one of Gianpierre's regular crew. Crossing the courtyard, Luciana was careful where she stepped and looked for any telltale signs that the ground was dipping. See? The Sicilian beauty asked, setting her hammer and chisel aside and standing up. She was reshaping the stone bricks to ensure the best fit possible. No filler was to be used between the rock bricks in many places, and maximum surface-to-surface contact was imperative for the bricks to lock in place with a good pressure and friction hold. Luciana had shaken hands with a woman once not long after being hired on as project manager. She would never make that mistake again. Michela had gotten goosed in the ribs by another worker just as their hands were locking. Startled, Michela had clamped down on her grip, and Luciana had thought that Michela had broken her hand. It was clear that Michela was all woman, but beneath her soft feminine features was work-hardened muscle. Luciana couldn't help but wonder if her and Gianpierre had ever been a pair. The woman was stunning, with high cheekbones, long, thick black hair, and eyes that had a mesmerizing smoky darkness that was not quite black and not quite brown. As for Gianpierre, he was certainly handsome enough to turn any woman's head. It would make sense that Gianpierre would find companionship with one of the people he traveled with most. Despite that, she'd never seen either of them look at each other with even a hint of that kind of familiarity. Luciana was the only one he ever seemed to look at with heat in his eyes, but it was hard for her to accept that she was not part of a convenient trend. "Nicola, have you or any of the others heard from Gianpierre this morning?" "Ah, see, he's there," she said, pointing past Luciana before returning to her work. Luciana turned around to see Gianpierre making his way across the courtyard. He was wearing his usual work-worn jeans, but also wore a navy blue suit jacket over top. Sex on a stick. The words were in her head without her invitation, and the intensity of her desire for her boss caught her off guard. Her cheeks heated, and she looked away, desperate for him not to see her blush. Squaring her shoulders and hugging her tablet to her chest like a shield, she hurried forward with quick, sure steps. Gianpierre would talk to her this time. She'd make him. As she neared, Gianpierre lifted an arm in preparation of waving someone over, but Luciana countered with a stern, "Sir?" His attention shifted to her, and she stepped close, so close that for him not to acknowledge her would require him to be bluntly rude. "Sir," she said again. "It's fine," he said at the same time that she said. "There's been a development in the catacombs." "What?" Gianpierre asked, his brow lifting. "Paolo discovered a room behind the blocked entrance. The room might be full of dirt and debris, or it might be open and susceptible to cave-in. It needs further evaluation." "Paolo!" Gianpierre called out, lifting his gaze to look out over Luciana's head. Luciana was tempted to raise up onto the tips of her work boots to make it harder for him to see past her, but resisted the urge. "Paolo is already down in the catacombs, sir." Gianpierre leveled a cool gaze on her as she used the word "sir" yet again. She cleared her throat. "Gianpierre," she corrected, and then felt her cheeks heat again. The magnetic pull of his bright blue eyes on her made her memory flash with seeing him naked. Gloriously naked. His lean body had been perfection, and the muscles that were hinted at beneath his clothes had not been a lie. If he had been crafted out of clay by a master's hands, he could have not been any more handsome and virile. "I will take you down into the catacombs to him." "No." Luciana's head bobbed backward, and her eyes went wide with surprise. "You have a young child to go home to. You will not go below with me. You do not belong there." Luciana's mouth fell open, and then she found her voice. "Sir," she said, purposely stressing the word, "I will do my job, and this is my job. There are time schedules to discuss, as well as materials, not to mention inspectors to be postponed." Gianpierre winced when she said, "postponed." "Sir, Gianpierre," she said, softening her tone, "I am good at my job. Please let me do my job." He looked her up and down, and his jaw tensed, but finally he gave a single nod. Turning on his heel, he headed for the main entrance to the catacombs. It was a roped-off opening in the courtyard floor that would eventually be sealed over with a custom-made door, which would sit flush with the surrounding cobblestone. Grabbing a couple of yellow hard hats sitting on the ground, Gianpierre handed one to her and put the other one under his arm. She stood staring and waiting with the hard hat in her hands, but Gianpierre didn't budge until she lifted it to sit atop her head. Then he turned away once more, shrugged off his jacket, and headed into the bowels of the Romano del Mare. Once they were below, Luciana moved into the lead. At nearly every turn of the tunnels, she referenced the map on her computer pad again. Even so, she got them lost and walking in circles. She kept waiting for Gianpierre to become impatient and chide her before ripping the computer pad away, but it never happened. Instead, he remained calm and patient, and eventually she was able to lead them to the spot that Paolo had found. He was there too, on his knees with a tubed videoscope in his hands. He'd pushed it through the jumble of rocks and dirt that filled an arched doorway in an attempt to see what was beyond. "Any luck?" Gianpierre asked, kneeling down next to Paolo and peering at the scope's monitor. Not yet. The debris is thick. The entire room might be a cave-in that was bricked over up above. But if it's not, Luciana knew what it was that Paolo wasn't saying. If the room was not completely full of stone and debris, there was a chance that the courtyard floor above the room could eventually give way. People could be hurt or even killed. Finding out what was inside the room was a matter of safety. "This scope's not long enough," Gianpierre said. "We need the 10-foot. "See, I'll get it," Paolo said. He was on his feet and gone in the next moment. He didn't have a map. He'd been down here so much that he knew his way around. Luciana's gaze moved to Gianpierre with a flash of realization. Gianpierre could have taken over and figured out where the uncovered room was in a matter of minutes, but he'd given her the chance to prove herself by allowing her to lead them to it instead. He could be so gruff and so hurried that his tendency for gentle leadership always caught her off guard. Gianpierre adjusted the light density of the small view screen. "It looks like mostly rubble. We could drill a coring hole through the top of the courtyard, but I'd rather not damage the top bricks." Standing, he left the monitor on the ground and shook his head. "I don't have time for this. I need it in Dubai. These setbacks, they're no good. They're ruining my schedule. I'm going to leave this. It will still be here when I'm ready." "Sir, Gianpierre, no, you can't." Her heart thudded heavily in her chest, and she felt lightheaded. She'd only just gotten approved for her loan. If she had to report back to the bank that her 2-week-old job had already ended, all the progress she'd made toward providing little Nathalia with a better life would slip away. She couldn't let that happen. Gianpierre shot her a sharp look in response to her declaration that he could not abandon the unfinished job. This was his show. She knew that. Not only was he one of the most sought-after medieval restoration experts in the world, he was also one of the 3 owners of this property. He could do whatever he pleased with it, even if that was shoving a stick of dynamite under the thing and blowing it up. Telling the man what he couldn't do wasn't going to work, Luciana quickly realized. So she tried a different approach. Taking a deep breath despite the dusty, stale air of the catacombs, Luciana willed her heart to slow and her body to relax. If she was tense, he'd be tense. And if she was relaxed, he might relax a little. Next, she smiled the biggest smile she could manage. But when that effort was met by Gianpierre's grunt as he refocused on the little monitor, she let the smile soften and then pressed forward with her new, gentler attack on his plans. "Is walling a section off to come back to it later something that's commonly done?" Gianpierre shrugged. "Sometimes." Luciana licked her lips nervously and was thankful that he wasn't looking at her to notice. "Is it something you've done in the past?" "Please say no, please say no." Gianpierre's lips thinned and his eyes narrowed as he shifted his attention back to her, but he did not give an answer. "Gotcha." Luciana resisted the urge to do a triumphant fist pump in the air. Gianpierre twisted the tubed camera scope in an effort to get it to travel into the rocky debris a little further. "You're right. I would not normally leave a cave-in until later, but situations change. It can't be helped. The entire project is taking too long. One delay after another. It's too much." He backed the tube out a few inches before attempting to push it back in at a different angle. Luciana shone her flashlight at the jumble of dirt and rocks at eye level. Tracing the edges of the curved archway, she spotted a rock that was only loosely wedged into the debris, and it seemed to have some space behind it. "There's a spot up here," she said, as she reached on tiptoes to pull the rock free. "Don't!" Gianpierre yelled, but his warning came after Luciana already had her fingers hooked around behind the rock and was in mid-yank. A small sound followed of dirt and rock cascading, but then, as if someone turned up the volume on a set of speakers, the sound grew. Luciana backed away from the clogged archway with her hands still lifted in the air where they had been when she'd pulled the rock. There was a grumbling that felt as much like vibration as it was sound, and then an avalanche. Rock, dirt, and heavy carved stones fell out of the archway as the archway itself lost its shape on one side. Fear shot through Luciana as she saw the dirt that would become her grave come down at her. Then, Gianpierre's long arms wrapped themselves around her body, and she was pulled hard onto her back on the ground. There, Gianpierre covered her head with his arms, head, and shoulders, while his torso and legs did a good job of shielding the rest of her. The air turned thick with dust that left Luciana gasping for air, and Gianpierre's powerful body lay unmoving on top of her, his added weight making it all the more difficult to breathe. "Sir? Gianpierre?" Terror filled Luciana that she had brought their deaths. She'd been a fool to insist on coming down into the catacombs. She'd only wanted to be seen as valuable to his team, but now she'd cost them both everything. Gianpierre moved with a groan, sending dust from his hat into Luciana's face. Squeezing her eyes shut, she coughed and spluttered, but then stilled when Gianpierre's fingers brushed the dirt away from her eyes and cheeks. "Are you all right?" Gianpierre's gruff voice asked. "Say you're all right." "I'm so sorry. I shouldn't have pulled that rock. Luciana," Gianpierre interrupted. "Are you all right?" "I'm so sorry." "It doesn't matter. Luciana, are you all right?" He held her face in both his hands, and even in the dim light, Luciana could see the brightness of his blue eyes. "Tell me you're all right." In the distance, Luciana could hear the yells of Gianpierre's crew, their voices muted as if yelling through a wall. Lost in the rubble, one of their flashlights blinked but then stabilized. "I'm all right," Luciana whispered, giving in to the feel of having Gianpierre's body on top of hers, his weight on her, as he held her, and stared down at her through the murky darkness with an intensity that unnerved her. Gianpierre's big thumb stroked her cheek as his eyes continued to search her face. His expression wasn't one of anger. It was defeat. Gianpierre's body shifted, and Luciana failed to stifle the tiniest of moans, filled with desperate want. Then he did the unthinkable. He dipped his head and pressed his warm lips to hers. His crew's frantic yells could be heard as they fought through the rubble to reach them, but it was as if he didn't care. The rest of the world didn't matter. There was only her, and the man whose kiss Luciana had craved to taste since the moment she'd met him ignited a hope in the future she hadn't realized had gone out. Wrapping her arms around him, Luciana kissed him back, opening herself to the caress of his tongue. What started out gentle turned into a fervent celebration of life as they lost themselves in each other, and they did not stop until the flow of fresh air reached them as Gianpierre's crew breached the barrier that stood between them and the rest of the world. 6. Gianpierre. "Why didn't she give me more time?" Gianpierre said to himself as he hurried through the apartment picking up discarded clothes and tidied stacks of paper. He'd gotten a call from Luciana only minutes ago that she was nearby and on her way over. He didn't know why he should care what his place looked like when Luciana arrived. After all, it was still his place. But he did care. Despite his best efforts to the contrary, the woman mattered to him, and he wanted to make the best impression on her that he could. That she was no one and nothing to him didn't seem to matter. As things stood, 4 days had passed since their kiss, and he feared that he'd taken things too far. He needed to know that she didn't feel taken advantage of. As her employer, he'd had no business kissing Luciana. On top of that, she was still grieving, and her entire financial well-being was dependent on him. Too much power over her life was in his hands, and that made for an unfair advantage. He'd seen it more than once, how a man would make a woman dependent on him in order to then bend her to his will through the motivation of desperation. He wanted no part of that way of life or that type of relationship. Relationship, he snorted, amused with himself as he stuffed a large bundle of dirty clothes into the clothes basket. He had no relationship with Luciana, not now and not ever. Then why did you kiss her? It wasn't a question that he got the chance to contemplate before a knock sounded at his door. "Come," he called out, not bothering to make the trip to the door. It was unlocked anyway, and besides, this was Luciana's new home. She simply had not moved in yet, and he had not moved out. "Is there something I can do for you?" he asked, making his way toward the entryway only to stop in his tracks. Luciana was wearing a simple burgundy tunic dress with a wide wraparound black belt and her hair pulled into a messy updo. The dress reached only halfway down her very long, gorgeous thighs, and the belt gave shape to curves that all her other clothes seemed to try to hide. It wasn't fair. She wasn't supposed to look this good. She was more beautiful than any runway model he'd ever seen, and he'd dated his share. How was he supposed to stop wanting her when she looked like that? "I can't date you," he blurted. It was Luciana's turn to stop in her tracks. She opened her mouth, only to close it again without actually saying anything. Gianpierre walked forward slowly, closing half the distance between them. "I can't want you. It's not right." Luciana nodded agreement, but then asked, "Why would it be wrong?" She licked her lips, as if remembering the way his mouth had felt on hers. "Because I'm leaving for Dubai, and you are staying here to raise your niece. Our lives, they're taking different paths. I don't know when I'll be coming back. It won't be soon. After Dubai, there will always be somewhere else." Luciana stepped forward, shortening the distance between them even more. "I don't want you." "That's not what your lips said when you were kissing me in the tunnels," Gianpierre countered, taking another step forward. They were within arm's reach of each other now. Luciana shrugged. "It was an adrenaline kiss. Fight or flight?" Gianpierre smiled. "Fight or flight? Or kiss?" It was Luciana's turn to smile, and she took her time at it. First, it was only the corners of her mouth that curled up, but then as they got higher, her entire face transformed when her smile reached her eyes. "Fight or flight? Or kiss?" She agreed, before shifting her attention to her over-the-shoulder spaghetti-strap purse. Opening its flap, she pulled out a measuring tape. "I need to measure Natalia's bedroom. Her mom, Sophia, she got Natalia a full-sized princess bed about a month before she died." Saying the words seemed to hurt her, but she pressed on. "I'm not sure that the ceiling in her room will be high enough. It's a 4-poster bed that arches up into a dome. It's very high." Her brows were pinched, and she fiddled with the tape measure as she spoke, clearly worried at the outcome. "There's no way I can ask her to part with it." Gianpierre felt like the most selfish man in the world as he stood before Luciana, and the ongoing pain of having lost her sister. Not only was she having to deal with the loss of someone dear to her, she was having to deal with the stress of having to rebuild her life and learn how to be a parent. He could not fathom how strong she must be to choose to raise Natalia here in Sicily, in the place the child knew best, rather than take her back to America, where life would surely be easier for Luciana. "Let us find out," Gianpierre said, gently taking the measuring tape from her grasp, and then carefully taking her by the hand. He knew that he was, yet again, stepping across boundaries that were better not crossed. He was playing with the heart of a woman with a shattered life. Making her think that there could ever be room for her in his life would not be right, and he needed to add some distance to their growing attraction soon. He could feel her loneliness, and he knew he wanted her. His body craved her with a need so powerful that it hurt, but to give in to his want would cause unforgivable damage. He didn't want a friend or a partner, and she needed both. She was a woman in a strange land with no support system, and anything he offered her would only get in the way of her building the life she needed. It would be like putting a dissolving bandage on a limb that needed a cast. He would cause her more harm than good. Yet the fit of her hand inside of his was perfect, and once they'd reached the bedroom that Luciana indicated was to be Natalia's, he found that he did not want to let her go. But he did. He made himself. Turning his back so that he would not have to torture himself by looking at her, he asked, "How tall is the bed at its highest point?" He walked toward the bedroom's far wall as he pulled the winding measuring tape out of its casing. 15 feet. Gianpierre gave a low whistle. That was tall. Glancing up at the ceiling, he was sure that it was too tall, but he would measure so that Luciana could see the same. With mixed feelings, Gianpierre pushed the end of the stiff aluminum tape up the wall to the ceiling before extending its length down to the floor. Kneeling, he checked the tape's reading. 14 feet, he said, and then stayed in place as he looked over his shoulder at Luciana. Stepping forward, she knelt down to read the results herself. That was when the fight seemed to leave her. She hung her head. Her shoulders drooped and her whole body slumped. "It's all too much," she said. "It's not going to work. None of it's going to work." Gianpierre was pretty sure that she was not talking about just the princess bed. Letting the spring-rolled measuring tape slip back inside its casing, Gianpierre shifted from kneeling to sitting and pulled Luciana down next to him. She didn't fight it, and instead gave in to leaning against his side and resting her head on his shoulder. "I can't do it," Luciana said. "I'm going to fail miserably as a mother. Sophia was so good at it. She was a natural. Nathalia deserves so much better than me." Gianpierre remembered the way the little girl had looked at Luciana. Her eyes had been sad, but there had been adoration in the way she had looked at Luciana. "The little girl loves you," he reassured her. "You're her world now." "But I'm not enough," Luciana lamented. She lifted her head from Gianpierre's shoulder and looked him in the eye. "Before losing Sophia, my biggest worry had been what I should wear out at the clubs, or whether or not I should let a man take me out to dinner or brunch for a first date. If I wanted to sleep, I slept. If I wanted to stay out all night, I did. If I wanted popcorn for dinner, I had popcorn." She shook her head. "I'm not the motherly kind." "If that's true, you're doing a great job of fooling Nathalia. She loves you. It's all over her face every time she looks at you." It was true. Gianpierre would never have been able to guess that Nathalia wasn't Luciana's own if he hadn't already known. He would have only seen a beautiful mother with her beautiful daughter. And he knew that as Nathalia grew and they moved through life together, that was exactly what the rest of the world would see when it looked at them. Whether she felt like it or not, Luciana was now Nathalia's mother. She was the little girl's foundation. "You're going to be okay," he said, and kissed the top of Luciana's head. Her hair was silky and smelled like lilacs, and the curve of her hip beneath his hand made him want to pull her into his lap so that he could hold her tight and never let her go. "You'll ruin her," he reminded himself. A woman with a shattered life didn't need a man to drift in and out of it, leaving her to pick up all the pieces before, during, and after. He fixed buildings, not people. Luciana lifted her face to look at him. "Would you stay with us?" "What?" All the thoughts of Gianpierre's head came to a screeching halt. "Would you stay with us here, in the apartment? I mean, just until the job is done and you leave for Dubai. Sophia's place sold this morning, and they want us out soon, which means we'll need to move in here sooner than I thought. I thought we'd be able to wait until you moved on. I don't feel right kicking you out of your home." A disorienting jolt hit Gianpierre as his eyes scanned the room. He had this bedroom set up for guests and used the third bedroom for his office. It finally sunk in. He was going to have to leave his home. He'd refused to think of the apartment as his home, but that's exactly what it had been for 10 years. During his travels, every time he found some antique map that he wanted to add to his collection, he'd had it mailed back here. Every time he'd envisioned where he'd put some newly found treasure, it had been here that his mind had gone. He thought of Nathalia's bed and how it was too tall for the room. Luciana had said there was no way that she would make Nathalia give it up. Since the bed didn't fit, maybe Luciana would change her mind and continue her search for the perfect place somewhere else. Then he could go back to Senora Rizzo with a clear conscience and buy the place after all. Instead, the words that came out of his mouth were, "See, I can stay, but only if I pay rent." "No," Luciana shook her head. "I couldn't ask that." "I insist. It is the only way." He waited for Luciana's answer. She hesitated, and then nodded her head yes. Relief filled Gianpierre. He couldn't bear the thought of being a squatter in what was now her home. He smiled and said, "And, if you want, I can make a modification to your niece's bed. I can cut some of the height from the corner posts so that the canopy will fit the room." Before he could stop her, Luciana stretched up to capture his lips in a kiss as she laid a hand behind his neck. But she broke the kiss just as fast, leaving him stunned and speechless. He wanted more. He needed the sweet ambrosia of her lips on his again, but the sound of her phone buzzing pulled her away. She answered it, said her greetings, and then, Yes, I'm on my way," as she climbed to her feet. Gianpierre watched her leave his home as easily as she'd walked into it, leaving him feeling shattered and incomplete. And he wondered how such a shift could have happened. He was the one with his life together, and his path was on course, and she was simply making things up as she went along, winging it. Yet it was him who was left undone by her. 7. Gianpierre. "Yes, sir, I understand," Gianpierre said loudly enough for his phone to pick up his voice. It was laying on his coffee table as he sat leaning forward in a chair. The latest copy of Architectural Digest lay next to his phone, and on its cover was a French and Spanish colonial fusion home, a design by one of the hottest new up-and-coming designers. Being on the cover informed the uneducated masses that the architect was exceptional at his job. Otherwise, people didn't know enough about design to recognize what was good versus what was magnificent. Making the cover made that clear for them. It didn't matter, though. Gianpierre wasn't going to make the cover of Architectural Digest if he didn't make it to Dubai on time. He'd hoped they would give him an extension on when he'd need to report, but it wasn't going well. But he wasn't ready to give up. He had been all but guaranteed the cover of the magazine at the conclusion of the build he was slated to oversee in Dubai, and it would provide worldwide recognition of his skill as the best medieval architect there was. The magazine would do that for him. And he really was the best, better than anybody else, regardless of the contenders that were close on his heels. "We simply cannot give you another 6 weeks to get here. If you cannot make it here in 4, we will need to proceed with the project with another specialist. You were our first pick, Gianpierre, but we cannot put off all the others waiting for it to begin. We have other talented members of the team who will need to back out if we do not proceed soon. Can you be here within 4 weeks? Gianpierre clenched his jaw and ground his teeth together as he closed his eyes in frustration. The project was a build of a lifetime. It was designing and building an extensive theme park, emphasizing authentic medieval structures to be made using the same tools and processes of the time. And the results were guaranteed a place on the cover of Architectural Digest, a long-held dream of Gianpierre's. Making matters worse, Gianpierre was not just slated to be a part of the team. He was slated to lead the build team and the design team. But how amazing the opportunity was didn't change anything. The answer was still no. In fact, finishing up with his part of the restoration of the Romano del Mare within 6 weeks would have been an improbability. 4 weeks was an impossibility. Even with as good as Luciana was at making sure they had everything they needed when they needed it, not even her help could make it possible. Gianpierre opened his eyes and stared down at his phone with determination. "I'll be there. 4 weeks." "Excellent. I will inform the teams." The call ended, and Gianpierre slouched back in his chair, angry with himself and angry with the world. To have his dream of leading the build team in Dubai, he was going to have to seal up the restoration efforts of the Romano del Mare and leave them until later. A lot later. The Dubai job was due to take a minimum of 4 years to finish, and the Romano del Mare's fate would be long sealed by then. The honor of restoring his family's legacy would be lost to him if he went to Dubai. His brothers would have to give his job to someone else. It would be a part of his life that would forever go unfinished. "Here!" Nathalia exclaimed, holding against her chest a laptop that was nearly bigger than she was. She all but dropped it in Gianpierre's lap before slapping the top of its hard shell with her open palm. "I want to watch videos about fairy castles," she barked out, as well as any good drill sergeant would. Little Nathalia and Luciana had moved in almost 2 weeks ago, and Gianpierre had already started to forget what it had been like to live in the apartment without them. He had thought that their constant presence would be an annoyance, but instead, the three of them had fallen into a comfortable rhythm of daily life that felt natural, So natural that Luciana had managed to talk him into babysitting while she had a girls' night out with his soon-to-be sister-in-law, Adeline. The two women had met on site at the Romano del Mare and had become instant friends. How Adeline had managed to talk his younger brother Niccolo into settling down, he had no idea. But, to the man's credit, Gianpierre had never seen Niccolo happier. He was going to be a father, and, to the surprise of both of his brothers, his pending fatherhood suited him. Gianpierre evaluated the demanding Nathalia as she stared him down with unblinking eyes, pouting lips, and her arms crossed over her chest. "What did your mama say about you watching videos online?" While the little girl had called her birth mother Matri, Luciana had encouraged her to adopt Mama to refer to her. It made sense. Nathalia was so young, and whether it was how they had wanted things to be or not, Luciana was now the little girl's mother. And sometimes a name did matter. Calling her Mama instead of Aunt would have an emotional impact in the years to come as Nathalia grew up into a young woman. It would lessen her sense of loss as she faced the many life benchmarks ahead of her. Gianpierre was sure of it. "She said I couldn't," she said in a world-class defiant pout. "So, why are you bringing me the computer?" "Because she didn't say that you couldn't watch the videos." Gianpierre's brows went up. Nathalia's argument was impeccable, yet he knew that it was a loophole Luciana would most likely not appreciate him helping Nathalia exploit. As he stared at the girl, and she stared right back at him, he appreciated how pure her want was. It was all very simple, with no conflicting feelings one way or another. She wanted to see fairy castles. Period. "You are a very smart girl," Gianpierre said, hoping to win her over to his side by starting out with a compliment. "But your mama, she's very stern. I don't want her to yell at me if she finds out that I helped you watch videos about fairy castles online. You know that she doesn't like you watching anything that she hasn't reviewed first." The little girl narrowed her eyes, apparently not pleased with the direction the conversation was going. Gianpierre could already hear her tantrum screams ringing in his head, and his mind raced to offer her an alternative they could both be happy with. Latching on to the perfect solution, he grinned from ear to ear. "What if," he said excitedly, "we make a fairy castle instead?" Making elaborate sandcastles with his grandfather had been a favorite memory of his. In fact, constructing them together, seeing how important the foundation was and how all the parts needed to work together, was what had sparked Gianpierre's love of medieval architecture. He couldn't have been much older than Nathalia at the time, and the thought of sharing a similar experience with her now suddenly flashed a spark of pure, unconflicted excitement in him. The first he'd felt in years, and he found himself holding his breath in hopes that Nathalia liked the idea. Nathalia's gaze went from his face down to the computer, back up, and then down again, before finally settling on his face once more. He could see her struggling with the desire to see the fairy castle videos that she'd had her heart set on. Then she cocked her head sideways, as if considering the situation from a new angle. "If we make a fairy castle, does that mean I'll have a fairy castle?" Gianpierre smiled. He had her. "It does. Your very own. I'm very good at such things, you know. Some would even say that I'm one of the best people in the world at making fairy castles." Nathalia smiled then, and it was as if the sun started shining on a gloomy day. Suddenly everything was brighter, and Gianpierre's worries slipped away. In comparison to her joy, everything else ceased to be very important. "Is that a yes?" he asked. "Yes." Gianpierre laughed, and then held out his hand. "Partners?" Nathalia's little hand curled around two of Gianpierre's fingers in a surprisingly strong handshake, and her answer was filled with unfiltered glee. "Partners!" 8. Luciana. Luciana closed her eyes and moaned as she took a bite of eggplant parmesan. Its creamy texture made it feel as though the delicious morsel melted in her mouth. "You don't moan like that around Gianpierre, do you?" Adeline asked with a laugh. Luciana's cheeks heated in embarrassment, but she couldn't stop her smile. She hadn't had a fun night out for herself in nearly 3 months, and she was determined to make this one count, given that she had no idea how long it would be before she got another one. Never before had she had to think of someone other than herself before making every single little decision. It was exhausting. How all the other parents of the world did it, she had no idea, but she now understood why. When Luciana's sister died, her niece became the most important person on the face of the planet, bar none. And while Luciana would have preferred to have her sister back, she now cherished her role as Natalia's mother. "Don't hold back," Adeline continued to tease. "Is he as good in bed as he looks?" "It's not like that," Luciana said, laughing. "But do you want it to be like that?" There was no laughing this time as Adeline posed her question. Luciana was surprised at how fast the two of them had bonded and become good friends, and she had definitely needed a friend. Adeline had become a lifeline to her sanity when the whole world seemed to spin out of control. "I don't know," Luciana said, slowly twirling her glass with the tips of her fingers as she stared down at it. "Maybe. Yes." Her smile broadened as she lifted her gaze to meet Adeline's. "I could handle a little stress relief." "Ha! The Romano boys are good at stress relief," Adeline winked. Luciana shrugged and said with a note of sadness in her voice, "He doesn't see me that way." Adeline choked on her drink in response to Luciana's answer. "What? The man's kissed you how many times?" Luciana sucked in air, surprised that Adeline would know such an intimate detail about her life. She hadn't told anyone. "Once." "You mean twice?" No, the second time I kissed him," Luciana declared, and then realized that she wasn't succeeding in making any kind of argument about Gianpierre's platonic-only interest in her. "Mm-hmm," Adeline hummed, with good-natured satisfaction. "He doesn't think you cute at all, and he just hates those mile-high legs of yours." Luciana leaned forward and whispered, "How do you know all of this?" And then, "He likes my legs?" "Those brothers are worse than a bunch of girls. They tell each other everything." "You caused a cave-in that nearly killed you and Gianpierre. So, while he had you down on the ground, he figured it was as good a time as any to get in the kiss he'd been dying to give you since the moment you first met. You almost kill him. He kisses you. He figured it was a fair trade." Adeline's eyes twinkled as she teased. Luciana smiled as she sat back in her chair. Instead of feeling as though her privacy had been invaded, she felt relieved. She'd been holding back from talking with and telling Adeline everything, since Adeline was engaged to Gianpierre's brother, Niccolo. She hadn't wanted to make things more awkward than they already were between them if word managed to get back to him that she'd been talking about him, and the way his lips had felt on hers. "He is such a good kisser," Luciana gushed. "And the way he put his body over mine to protect me from all of that falling stone," she sighed. "They don't make men like that anymore." "I heard that you saw him naked and that you're living together now." Luciana's smile reached her eyes. "I guess we're doing things a little backwards," she giggled. "When I asked him to stay instead of moving, I just blurted it out. I hadn't even thought through it. It just felt right." "Do you regret it?" "Oh, no, not at all. After I asked him, I stressed out about it and was double-guessing myself, but then everything went so well. Did you know that he moved most of his stuff into a storage unit and then hired movers to get us completely moved out of our place and into his place within one day? This army of people and trucks showed up, got us packed, got us moved, and then got us unpacked, and all of our furniture in place with the beds set up and made before dinner time. He had layout drawings taped to the wall in every room and took me around to each one so that I could make changes. Then the movers set everything up to match those drawings of his." She couldn't help but shake her head in amazement, even though that move had been 4 weeks ago. "Then he made us dinner, and it was good. Did you know he can cook?" Adeline laughed and shook her head. "No, but it doesn't surprise me. All of the brothers, when they decide to learn something, it's like they get this burning need to not only learn it, but to conquer it. They want to best it. They don't like not being in control of their world." "I'm seeing that, which amazes me all the more that Gianpierre was willing to let us turn his world upside down by staying with us. I mean, when there's a 5-year-old little girl in the house, it's fun for the adults to think that they're in control, but it's all an illusion." "Are you liking motherhood?" Adeline asked gently. "I am. I really, really am. I love it." Her eyes teared up, but she didn't let the tears fall. "I get it now. For a while after Sophia had Nathalia, I felt as though I'd lost my sister because everything about her became about Nathalia. But I get it now. She's worth it. She's amazing, and I thought I loved her before, but that was nothing. She's everything to me now." Adeline's thoughtful smile seemed to sink her thoughts inward. "How are you doing? Are you looking forward to the little one getting here?" Adeline put her hand on her still almost flat belly, and she smiled with a glow that came from within. "I am." When her eyes teared up, she did let them fall, but it was clear that they were tears of joy. "And Niccolo? He's happy too?" "The man's a wreck," Adeline laughed. "He wants everything to be perfect, but he's so happy too. Everywhere he goes, he fits into the conversation that we're going to have a baby. We went out to eat, and he told the valet who was parking the car. He struck up a conversation with a gaggle of old women, and I know it was just so that he could tell them that he was going to be a brand new papa." She laughed. "You should have seen those women fawning over him. If he didn't have a big head before, he does now. But," she sighed, "he's scared too. I see it in the quiet moments. So much in the world is changing, and he so wants her to have a beautiful life." Something about Adeline's words describing Niccolo's devotion to their unborn child struck a chord for Luciana, and she couldn't help but think about Gianpierre. She had imagined that she would have to do her best to keep Nathalia from bothering him, but the little girl absolutely adored him. She followed him around everywhere, and he was always so calm that it seemed to make Nathalia calmer too. She'd even stopped searching their home for her matre during the middle of the night. Her nightmares had eased, and she'd giggled until she snorted at dinner the other night as Gianpierre explained the finer points of how to eat corn on the cob while getting maximum butter smear on his face. He was a surprise at every turn, and Nathalia loved him. She was happier with him in her life, but he was going to leave. A sick feeling balled itself high in Luciana's stomach, making her feel nauseous. She had set the little girl up for a second huge loss. Gianpierre was going to leave, and he wasn't going to be back for years. Nathalia was only 5. Even the length of 4 years, the anticipated completion time needed for the Dubai job, would have her nearly twice as old as she was now. That was an eternity for a child. For all practical purposes, he was going away, and he was not coming back. "I've made a huge mistake," she said, as anguished panic rose within her. "What? What's wrong?" Adeline reached across the table and grasped Luciana's hand. Concern etched her face and squeezed her brows closer together. "I've set that little girl up for misery. She lost her mother, and now she's going to lose Gianpierre. He'd be on a plane tonight for Dubai, and not even look back if he thought he could drop the Romano del Monte project that fast. She means nothing to him, but he's the world to her. I've messed up. I've messed up so bad. What am I going to do?" Adeline's lips said a silent "oh" as understanding settled in. "He'd never hurt her," she said, giving Luciana's hand a reassuring squeeze. "I know that he wouldn't set out to, but that's what's going to happen. I pulled him into Natalia's life, and now I have to get him out. And I've got to do that as soon as possible." 9. Gianpierre. "You did what?" Luciana's cheeks colored, and Gianpierre didn't see 1 ounce of good humor in her eyes. She was fresh back from her girls' night out, but the evening hadn't seemed to do anything to soften her reaction to what Gianpierre had done. "I called a nanny service," Gianpierre said again, wondering more than a little bit if he'd crossed a line. He'd only wanted to help, and he had to get her to see that. "Nathalia and I started work on a fairy castle." "A fairy castle?" Luciana interrupted, her tone flat, her eyes narrowed, and her beautiful lips thinned. "Yes," Gianpierre said, eager to restore her feelings of goodwill toward him. "Nathalia wanted to watch videos about fairy castles, and I knew that you had told her that she wasn't allowed to watch online videos without you. So, instead of watching videos about fairy castles, I offered to help her build one." Luciana crossed her arms over her chest. "And that led you to call a nanny service?" "Well, no, not directly. But while we were working on the building plans, little Nathalia talked, and I listened. She said that one of her teachers at her daycare snapped at her when she woke up from a bad dream during nap time. The woman told her that she was a bad girl and to go stand in the corner." Luciana's eyes went wide, her mouth fell open, and her arms fell to her sides. "What's her name? Tell me. I'll rip her heart out through her throat," Luciana growled, as her entire body went into fight mode. Gianpierre had to resist the urge to take a step back and instead took a step forward. He moved carefully, as if approaching a wild mother cougar protecting her young. Every muscle in Luciana's body was tight and she was ready to pounce, but it was him who was in her line of sight. He needed her to know that he was looking out for Nathalia and that he wanted to protect her too. "We can't have you maiming anyone," Gianpierre soothed. "Nathalia needs her mama. She needs you, and she doesn't need to be around someone who isn't willing to put her needs before their own, like the lady at the daycare. So I called a nanny service, and they are sending someone over tonight." Luciana took a tense breath, as if preparing to deliver a cutting verbal onslaught, but Gianpierre quickly continued speaking in order to stave off the tempest of her anger. "If you like the nanny, we keep her. If we don't, we send her away. But," he held up a finger, "she specializes in children who have experienced traumatic events." And just like that, all the breath and all the tension that Luciana had been holding in as she readied her attack whooshed out of her. Even her shoulders sagged. "She specializes in traumatized kids?" "She does," Gianpierre said, stepping close enough to take Luciana's hand in his. He led her to the couch where he sat her down and then sat down next to her. "This is a good thing. Nathalia doesn't need anyone making her feel bad about what she's going through. She deserves better than that." Luciana shook her head. "I can't afford that. I can barely afford this home. And when you're gone? When my job is gone? I don't even have a next step in place yet. I don't know how I'm going to make this work. And now this? I can't afford a nanny. I want the best for Nathalia, but there's only so much I'm capable of." Gianpierre's chest tightened at seeing Luciana's struggles without the filter of time or space. If he wasn't living with them, and if he hadn't gotten the chance to get to know Nathalia, she would simply be some little girl who mattered a lot to somebody else. She wouldn't even be a blip on his radar. But he had met her, and he did care about her, and he couldn't turn his back on her needs. Or Luciana's. "You aren't going to pay for the nanny, I am. I call the agency, and I'm going to take care of this. Not you. Not now, and not ever. Not while you are working for me, and not after I go to Dubai. I'm going to pay for the nanny." "You can't do this," Luciana said, but her voice cracked. "I can't ask you to." "You didn't ask me, and I am doing what I need to do. I need to be the man who makes sure that Nathalia is okay." He paused as he stared into Luciana's beautiful, worry-stricken face, and then he did the unthinkable. Lifting a hand, he cupped Luciana's cheek in his palm and stroked her with the brush of his thumb over her soft skin. "I need to be the man who makes sure that you're okay." Luciana gasped and jerked her head away from his touch and then abruptly stood up. But Gianpierre stood up with her. Capturing her face in his hands, he held her gaze with his own. Then, leaning in slowly, he gave her the chance to refuse him before he took her lips with his own. His lips were sweet and delicate, and while they didn't kiss him back at first, Luciana's hands soon found their way to his sides, and she leaned into him, opening her mouth in invitation for him to take the kiss deeper. "You're going to leave her. You're going to leave us," Luciana said in a whisper against his lips when they came up for air. It was a truth that laid his soul bare because he couldn't refute it. He was going to leave them both, and he wasn't going to come back for years. He had a goal: get on the cover of Architectural Digest. He was so close to achieving that goal that he could practically reach out his hand and touch it. He wouldn't turn his back on that now, no matter how much he enjoyed the company of the beautiful woman before him. A sturdy knock sounded at the door. Luciana turned and walked away, and Gianpierre felt the chill of her absence. Before that second, he'd thought that growing his career and his prestige as the premier expert in medieval architecture was the most important thing in his life. But in that moment, insurmountable doubt filled him. He wanted Luciana. He wanted everything about her. The way she threw her head back and laughed without trying to be demure or dainty. The way worry crinkled at the corners of her eyes. The way she cooked, terribly, in the kitchen with Nathalia. God, she was an awful cook. She burned half of everything she tried to make, yet somehow it only endeared her to him more. I have to get away from her, and I have to do it soon. It was the warning toll of a cathedral-sized bell that rang in his head. His desire to go was slipping away. She was stealing his drive to be the best of the best, replacing it with his need to be their best, their everything. He'd seen his brother Niccolo turn away from a career-defining project that would have kept him on the lips of other developers for decades. He wouldn't make that same mistake. He wouldn't trade his future for the happiness of a woman, not even the wonderful Luciana and her charming ward, Nathalia. He followed Luciana at a distance toward the door and watched as she opened it, and a comfortably plump middle-aged woman introduced herself as Signora Esposito. Her presence was instantly gracious and calming, and Gianpierre breathed a private sigh of relief that his girls would be okay even without him. He would quietly see them through any financial hardships that faced them, never letting Luciana know that he was her financial backer, and he would make sure that both she and Nathalia had the resources they needed to be able to thrive. With a nanny like Signora Esposito on hand, Luciana would be freed to pursue whatever job that arose that best suited her skills and her needs, and he would make damn sure that those jobs became available to her. His family's name, and his name specifically, was well known and well respected within the land development community. With only a few well-placed phone calls, he would ensure that Luciana had her pick of jobs waiting for her when he moved on. She and Nathalia would be okay, and they would be okay without him. He was still a free man. Nothing had changed, no matter how much he felt as though everything had. "Nathalia," Luciana called, "there's someone here that I'd like you to meet." Gianpierre stayed in the background and watched as Luciana knelt so that she was eye to eye with Nathalia as she introduced the little girl to her new governess. Once he moved out, Signora Esposito would move in and take up residence in his vacated bedroom and be available regardless of Luciana's schedule. It was yet another reason that he should move on as soon as possible. Signora Esposito had specialized training in dealing with childhood trauma as well as a strong educational background in the sciences and the arts. She would be an excellent tutor as well as a guardian and care provider. He'd miss the little girl and her new mother, but him leaving was inevitable. It didn't matter that a growing part of himself didn't want to leave. He'd throw himself into his new job, and everything else would cease to matter. It's how it always was for him. The people he left behind always faded in importance. Over the years, he learned to accept that about himself. Slipping into the back hallway, Gianpierre climbed the tucked-away staircase that led up to the roof. There, he leaned on the stone banister that lined the rooftop. Night had fallen and blanketed the small town below him. Unseen in the distance, he could hear the Ionian Sea lapping against the shore and the gentle sounds of small-town life. Above him, the stars seemed to twinkle and blink, and he wondered what celestial bodies would be visible to him once he got to Dubai. The sound of a door closing caused him to turn around. Still in her wraparound dress that hugged her every curve and the strappy black stilettos she'd worn during her girls' night out, Luciana appeared like a vision in the soft glow of the underwater lights that lit the long, narrow lap pool that he'd had installed. "I'm sorry," he said, beating her to the punch. He didn't know if she'd come to the roof to fight, but she'd made a formidable foe, and he didn't want to take that chance. There were so many things he wanted to do to her at that moment, but fighting simply wasn't one of them. "For what? For looking out for us? Taking care of us?" Gianpierre smiled. I am sorry for doing something that wasn't mine to do." It was a lie. He wasn't sorry. He'd do it again, and again, and again. Whatever it took to take care of them, but those were not the words to say to a strong, smart, and independent woman such as Luciana. With a slow walk that swung her hips round like a hypnotic metronome, Luciana closed the distance between them. "Natalia's downstairs with one of the biggest smiles I've ever seen on her face. So, I'm not sorry you took control. You did something that I couldn't have done on my own, and I won't deny the joy that brings her just to save my pride." She stopped mere inches from Gianpierre's chest. "Thank you," she said, and then reached up on tiptoes to put a kiss on his cheek. The next one graced his lips. Gianpierre didn't kiss her back. Not at first. His heart pounded so hard and so loud, he thought it was a wonder that she didn't hear it. And he knew that he was standing on the edge of a cliff. One step, one slip. That was all it would take to fall into Luciana's arms and never be able to climb his way back up and away from her. But then the touch of her hand came to rest on his chest, and she nuzzled her nose into his neck before kissing him there. And he knew he'd already fallen. He'd fallen weeks ago, but he'd been in too much of a delusional daze to realize it. He'd lost his control to Luciana the moment she'd walked into his life. And he didn't want it back. Ever. 10. Luciana. I know we shouldn't, Luciana whispered, as she rubbed her cheek against the edge of Gianpierre's stubbled jaw. She was his employee, but he smelled good, of musk and earth, and she breathed him in as deep as her lungs would take him. She knew that he wasn't going to stay, that he was going to leave, and it was going to be as soon as he could. But he was here tonight. It was enough. You are a bewitching vixen, but you are right. I can't be this for you, Gianpierre said, his hands someplace that was not on her. What? You can't be my lover for a night? Luciana teased as she dragged the tip of one nail down his shirt. Gianpierre growled, but he still didn't touch her. Is that all you want? A night? Luciana went still as she looked up into his eyes. A part of her had felt empty since the day that her sister had died, but somehow that feeling had eased since getting the job with Gianpierre. When she wasn't with Nathalia, the job was her purpose and focus. Plus, Gianpierre's presence had slowly become a comfort to her. All she had to do was be near him, and he had a way of eclipsing all of her fears with his calm strength. He could be so gruff, so dismissive, yet she never felt safer than when she was with him. What I want is for you to remind me what being a woman feels like. Gianpierre growled, and his chest vibrated beneath Luciana's hand. It was then, finally, that he put his hands on her. Trailing them up the long line of her back, he sank the fingers of one hand into her thick hair and squeezed, pulling her head back and tilting her face up higher. You could have any lover, anyone. Why me? Is it because I'm here? Because I'm convenient? Yes. Luciana threw the word at him, like she was throwing a knife, and felt his fingers tighten even more in her hair. Of course it wasn't true. She didn't want him because he was convenient. She wanted him despite how wrong he was for her. She wanted him because she hadn't been able to bring herself to want anyone else. He didn't need to know that, though. He didn't need to know how special he was to her. She was setting herself up for heartbreak by inviting him into her bed, in a manner of speaking, and she hated him for that. But it didn't stop her from wanting him. Then find another, Gianpierre ground out through clenched teeth. In that instant, he released her hair and was gone, stepping away. They weren't on the restoration site yet, but Luciana felt the earth shift beneath her feet. What is this? She demanded. At first, you barely look at me, but now you live with me. You kissed me in the tunnels without invitation, but now you push me away? What is your game? The pain of being rejected by someone she wanted so much made her temples throb, and made it difficult to think clearly. Even though he hadn't done so, she felt as if she had been bodily shoved away from him with a violence that filled her with a venomous anger she'd never felt before. She'd been holding in so much since her sister had died, bottling it all up and making sure she was forever the strong one so that Nathalia could feel secure and safe. But now, all her feelings of abandonment boiled their way to the surface and focused on Gianpierre's retreating back. Taking off her strappy sandals, she threw one of them at him and hit him square between his heavily muscled shoulders. Look at me, she yelled. Don't walk away from me. You don't get to walk away from me. Everyone left her. Everyone. And she couldn't take it happening tonight. Gianpierre whirled on her and stalked forward with long strides that devoured the distance between them. He came at her so fast that despite her demands that he give her his full attention, Luciana walked backwards until she hit the small windowed shed that he'd constructed as a rooftop gym. His powerful hands were on her arms below her shoulders a second later, and his touch sent a jolt of electricity through her. His simple nearness did something to her. It made her defiantly happy to be alive. "I don't want you," Gianpierre rumbled low in his throat, with his head tilted and leaning forward as if ready to kiss her, and Luciana couldn't tell if he was talking to her or to himself. She had the sense that he was fighting an internal war, one that he was losing, but then his face hardened. "You're trouble. You're a burden." Luciana gasped, and her hands shot out to slam her palms into his chest. She knew that wasn't enough to move him if he wasn't willing to move, but her force pushed him aside all the same. A burden? In the half-second of selfish grief after her sister had died, that was how she had seen Nathalia. A burden that she wasn't ready for and didn't want. But she'd been wrong. Nathalia was a burden that blessed her life every single second of every day. Tears stung Luciana's eyes as she marched back toward the door that would lead to the apartment below, but she never reached it. Gianpierre's hand closed around her arm and turned her to face him. Toe to toe, chest to chest, they stood with their faces mere inches from each other. "I don't want you," Gianpierre said again. "But you have turned me into a man who has to have you. Before you, I'd been content, I'd been happy. But now, all I do is want, and you're always at the center of it." Despite his angry words and tone, he brushed a tear away from Luciana's cheek with a feather-light touch. "You and that little girl, you're eclipsing everything I've worked toward in my life, and it's killing me. I am not the man I was when I met you. You've replaced him, and left a person who is torn in two. How can I be in Dubai doing what I must do and still be here with you? Making love to you, and living my life for you." "Kiss me, or move out tonight," Luciana said on her breath. "Stop living on the fence." She didn't know where the words came from, but they were there, and within her aching heart she knew that she meant them. She couldn't be half of who she was with Gianpierre anymore. She needed him to need her as badly as she needed him. And it wasn't a want. It was a need. A painful one. Gianpierre dipped his head forward so that his lips brushed hers. "I'm going to kiss you, and I still have to leave. Not tonight, but I will leave." "Then do it already," Luciana taunted. "Kiss me." That was all it took. Gianpierre's hands were in her hair, and his mouth was crushing hers. Luciana's hands clawed at his back as she climbed his body to wrap her long legs around his hips. She kissed him back as hard as he kissed her, until her mind filled with the sense of him and pushed all things of everything else about her life out. All worry left her. All consequences were gone. There was only him and his body against hers. Visceral. Animal. It was all she wanted from him. Needed from him. Their kiss never faltered as Gianpierre walked them blindly forward. With one jerk, the door of his small rooftop gym was nearly torn off its hinges. And it was not until Gianpierre had her lying on her back atop the forgiving, cushioned gym floor mats that his kiss softened. She fought him when she felt his body ease against hers. She didn't want a lover in him. She wanted someone to have sex with. He wasn't going to stay, and she didn't want her body to be deceived into thinking that he cared. Someone who cared didn't just up and leave the person they cared about, and that meant she was nothing to him. She wouldn't have him fooling her into thinking otherwise. So, she sank her hands into his thick hair and squeezed as she intensified their kiss back into its formerly crushing intensity. But Gianpierre's hands closed around her wrists and lifted her arms above her head and pinned them to the floor. He then lifted his chest away from hers as he gave more of his weight to his elbows. "Let me go," Luciana demanded, struggling to regain control of her arms so that she could rip the shirt off his back. "Not like this, cuore mio," he said. She recognized the words. He was calling her his heart, and it made her fight him more. She would not believe he cared about her more than what was convenient for him to do. She tried to sit up enough to take back control of their now absent kiss, but with her hands pinned over her head, she wasn't able to. Anger raged within her, and she bit back words designed to cut and injure. Not like this, Gianpierre whispered again, and he let his body weight gently settle on top of her. He blanketed her with himself, and before Luciana knew what was happening, her lower lip began to quiver. "She wasn't supposed to leave me," she said, her voice full of anguish. "We had our whole lives in front of us. It's not fair. Why couldn't she have just made the trip to the airport 1 minute earlier or 1 minute later? Why did it have to be right then? I was just coming to visit for a couple of weeks. I didn't know everything was going to change." Her voice broke, and her breath grew staggered as hot tears fell from the corners of her eyes. Gianpierre released her wrists and stroked her hair as he pressed his cheek to hers. "Sometimes our lives change when we're not looking, Chiara mio." Luciana wrapped her arms around his back and held on as her breath stole away from her body and silent cries filled the air. It was the first time she had cried, really cried, since Sophia had died. She had wanted to before, had needed to, but had always felt too selfish to let go. Somehow, though, she felt allowed to do that with Gianpierre. He made the world calmer and less rushed. He made it okay to be herself. He was strong enough to let her fall apart. When his lips found hers again, she let him lead her in a kiss that opened her heart despite the scars left on it from the loss of her sister. She held to him and lost herself in his gentle touch as his lips trailed across her cheek to capture the lobe of her ear.
Sorry, readers. Here's where we fade to black due to YouTube explicit content guidelines. If you dream for the steam, you'll need to take a look in the book.
The walls he built around his heart crumbled. She could feel it. She was sure of it. And just as she'd been at the start, he was now naked with her. Truly naked, bare, and vulnerable. She held him tight. She held him until his labored breath slowed, and the shields of his heart seemed to reconstruct themselves. She could tell when the distance between their souls increased, even though the heat of their bodies, flesh against flesh, was still entangled. "He will never be mine," she reminded herself again. And this time, she believed it. 11. Gianpierre. "Nathalia, your designs for the fairy castle are so good," Gianpierre praised. But the little girl held up Gianpierre's design in front of her and held her head cocked to the side as she assessed it with squinting eyes. Finally, she let the paper fall back to the table and said with definitive certainty, "Yours is better. I want that castle." She poked her finger at it. Leaning forward, Gianpierre looked over his design with a fresh eye. It had spires, a curving staircase that traveled up the side of a cliff, a winding road, a moat with a working drawbridge, an inner and outer courtyard, a dragon's nest, a hidden entrance, and a wizard's tower. He had to admit, it was a rather ambitious undertaking. "Do you think we can do it?" he asked her with a conspiratorial wink, earning a giggle from the little girl. She nodded her head emphatically while dancing in place in excitement. Gianpierre nodded his agreement. "I think so too. Let's do this." With the clock ticking down to his departure and the work hours at the resort ramping up, he knew that they had no time to waste. The nanny, Signora Esposito, was working out better than he'd ever imagined. Nathalia was happier, and his darling Luciana was looking more rested. The two of them even got the chance to sneak away to the rooftop for some private time many of their evenings together. They were discreet about the relationship that was evolving between them. It was almost as if they had an unspoken agreement to keep what they were becoming to each other private. Since it was temporary, there was no reason to involve anyone else, least of all Nathalia. She didn't need the confusion. As ever, the clock was ticking, and Gianpierre was leaving. Every day, the inevitable drew that much closer. Gianpierre heard the apartment door open and close, and then he heard the familiar steps of Luciana. With her arrival, a tension he hadn't realized he'd been holding in his shoulders left him. It happened every time. He would realize she was near, and his body would relax. He'd never experienced anything like it before with any other woman he'd been involved with. As always, they would walk into the room, and his neck would tense, or he would need to get up and aimlessly pace the room. It was as though he'd been afraid of being trapped, but that wasn't how it felt being with Luciana. She put him at ease. She made him glad to be where she was. "Hi, honey," Luciana said in greeting as she stroked Natalia's strawberry gold hair and kissed her head. "Look, Mama," she said, holding up the drawing of the fairy castle that she and Gianpierre had plans to build. "Very nice," Luciana exclaimed, but flicked her gaze to Gianpierre from the corner of her eye. Understanding her concern, Gianpierre assured, "We'll make it happen." "Sweetie, why don't you go help Senora Esposito? I hear her in the kitchen." "She's making dinner," Nathalia announced with an abundance of enthusiasm. "We are in for a treat then." "Okay," she said, steering Nathalia to turn around and then giving her a gentle send-off push to get her moving. "You head on in there, and I'll be in there to help in a few minutes." Gianpierre felt as though he was being called into the principal's office at school when Luciana sat down in the chair adjacent to him. He had the distinct feeling that he was in for a talk. "I spoke with Gerald Clement. He said that he'd heard back from you and that you'd told him you were going in another direction at this time. You told him that he wasn't the right fit to take over the Romano del Mare renovations on the courtyard, cellars, and catacombs?" "So?" Gianpierre said, shrugging his shoulders. He knew what was coming next, but he would not make it easier on her. If she wanted to berate him for being picky on who he handed the job over to, that was her problem, not his. He didn't care if he only had 2.5 weeks before he had to report to Dubai, yet had 4.5 months' worth of repairs to work through at the resort. The Romano del Mare was his family's most indelible legacy, and he would not turn over its restoration to a hack. "Gianpierre," Luciana hissed in an agitated whisper as she leaned forward. "He is one of the best medieval architects in the world. How could he not be a good fit? He's worked on more medieval monasteries than anyone else, even you." Gianpierre's temper flashed at the implication that there was someone to whom he might be second best, but he kept it in check. He wasn't right for the job. He would have come in and done everything to his own vision. He would not have listened to the Romano del Mare and asked her who she wants to be. He is too heavy-handed in his restorations. He is too autocratic. Everything would be his way or no way at all. Luciana arched her brows at him. "Really? He's too autocratic?" Gianpierre grunted and waved off her challenge, but then watched as her shoulders sagged, and she took a deep breath, then let it out as if she were defeated. It made him regret his hard-headedness, yet he could not back down. He had to go. That was true. He had to be in Dubai, but he could not bear the thought of seeing another man in his place, with Luciana standing at his side. She would have her little computer tablet ready to jot down anything he said, and she would hang on his every word. That image, that thought, it was eating him alive. "I cannot. He is wrong for the job. I'm sorry, Luciana, but I cannot leave." He paused, stopping short of saying that he could not leave her, but swallowed that down and said, "The Romano del Mare to anyone else's care." Luciana threw up her hands. "That's it then. Let's call the project a wrap and shut the whole thing down. We'll cover the holes with tarps, put caution tape around the entire courtyard, and tell the tourists next year that those sections are out of bounds. It will still be here when you get back in 4 to 6 years." Luciana's expression was stony, harsh even, and her words made him ashamed of the position he was putting her, his brothers, and the Romano del Mare in. Yet he wasn't able to make himself budge. "I'm sorry, Luciana. Gerald Clement is a good man, but he's not right for this job." He stood up from the table. "Keep looking. There's someone who can take over, I'm sure. Just as long as that someone was, say, an 80-year-old woman, and not anyone who could ever replace him in Luciana's life." Half a week had passed, and Gianpierre had watched as Luciana scoured the globe in search of a medieval architect who could replace him. Time after time, she crossed the person off her list, all on her own without any input from him, as she recognized that their skill was not of a quality needed to continue the work that he had started. There were few people left in the world who would have the necessary qualifications to even be considered for the position, and he sympathized with her predicament. She needed a way to continue to pay her bills, and she wanted their part of the Romano del Mare restoration to continue uninterrupted. He wanted her to stop pushing him away and rushing him out the door. He knew he had to leave, but she had begun treating him like he'd already gone. Most hurtful was the way she always found excuses for Nathalia to go and be somewhere else when he was around. But he had come up with a solution, and it was a brilliant one. He would be able to leave for Dubai, and she would be able to continue in her role as project manager. He'd arranged it all. He would leave Paolo behind to lead the team with which Gianpierre had worked with for years. They knew the job. They understood the techniques. Starting on the enormous new project in Dubai without his personal team by his side to help oversee the activities of hundreds of others would be far less than ideal, but it would be doable. Meanwhile, Gianpierre would guide Paolo in how to proceed at the Romano del Mare through video calls, photographs, schematics, and any other tools necessary to get the job done. He would even fly back to oversee the project in person every chance he got. In fact, he would continue to sublet the room from Luciana in her, he corrected, apartment. Nothing had to change. Now all he needed to do was to find her and tell her the good news. "Luciana!" he called, as he rounded a corner to walk down yet another corridor within the body of the Romano del Mare's main buildings. "Luciana, where are you?" The inside restoration team had told him that she'd gone this way. A door halfway down the hall opened, and Luciana stepped out and closed the door behind her. Seeing her, Gianpierre broke into a jog, but she did not seem pleased to see him when he reached her. "What?" she asked, keeping her voice unusually soft. "Why are you whispering?" He took a step back and looked Luciana over from head to toe. "And why are you dressed this way?" Gone was her loose-fitting clothes, suitable for the dirt, grime, and sometimes dangerous conditions within which they worked. Instead, she wore a snug pencil skirt with a high slit and a silky blouse with a plunging neckline. To make matters worse, she even wore a necklace that hung low on her chest to draw the eye to her flawless skin and the swell of her softer, more generous parts. "What are you doing? And why do you have on pumps? You won't be able to walk in the courtyard in those." "Gianpierre," Luciana said, firmly but calmly. "I'm busy. Can we do this later?" Gianpierre stared at her, then noted the way she stood protectively in front of the closed door. "Who's in there?" he asked, his voice dropping dangerously low. She was interviewing someone for his job. He knew it. But this wasn't the way it was supposed to go. She had to stop. "Gianpierre." "Tell me," he said, cutting her off, and then tried to reach past her to the doorknob, but the shift of her hip kept him from his goal. "Gianpierre, let's talk a moment." Her voice had taken on a desperate, pleading tinge that set Gianpierre's nerves on alert all the more. His hands were on her shoulders the next moment, and he physically moved her out of his path. Throwing the door open, he stepped into the doorway and stared at the man who sat in the room before him. "No!" Gianpierre's voice boomed. "Not him!" It was Silas Gransky, a man every bit as tall as him, with the rugged look of a battle-worn Viking. If it could be said that Gianpierre had an arch-nemesis, that person would be Gransky. Every single elite job that Gianpierre had ever been a contender for, he'd had to fight to win it over Silas Gransky. And half the time he lost. He'd almost lost the Dubai job to him, and Gianpierre was sure that Dubai had the man on speed dial in the event that he didn't show up in another 2 weeks. "Not him," he said again, intoning the words with the same vehemence as Moses telling the Red Seas to part. "Gianpierre," Luciana said, grabbing his arm with a firm ownership that only a lover would use. "He's all that's left. If not him, then the restoration of the Romano del Mare's courtyard gets shut down for years." "I'm fine with that," he said, before tearing his arm free of her hold. "And what is this? All of this?" He indicated her clothes with the wave of his finger up and down. "You think he'll keep you on if you turn his head?" Luciana's eyes flew wide as she gasped. Then her eyes narrowed, and her open palm shot up toward Gianpierre's face, but he caught her wrist in midair before her slap could connect. Gianpierre leaned in so that he could almost feel her heat on his skin. "You'll mean nothing to him." "Just like I mean nothing to you?" she shot back without hesitation. Out of the corner of his eye, Gianpierre could see Gransky's amused grin. That there was more between him and Luciana than an employer-employee relationship was painfully obvious. and Gianpierre was sure that the man would love his chance to try to best him in that arena as well. In contrast to Gransky's relaxed demeanor, Luciana looked ready to disembowel Gianpierre. Her teeth were bared, and her eyes all but glowed with the embers of her rage. But it only made Gianpierre want her more. His head pounded as it was battered with images of Luciana and Gransky working together as Gransky wore her down day after day, romancing her, until finally Gianpierre became replaced in every sense of the word. The thought was more than he could bear. While it was true that he could lose her to somebody else, it wouldn't be while she worked the job that she'd done with him. "Get out," he growled at her. "You're fired." "No." It was her turn to rip her arm free of his hold. "I quit." 12. Luciana. "What just happened?" Luciana asked herself as she stormed out of the front door of the Romano del Mare. She was shocked by the sudden turn of events. She had set up a meeting with a man who was considered among most circles within the industry as Gianpierre's closest peer. There were very, very few who could compete with Gianpierre's level of expertise. Yes, there were those who excelled in specific areas, such as the most accurate way to mix mud-based binders equivalent to practices used in the summer of 539 in Sussex, England. But in terms of overall knowledge base, a solid argument could be made, as it had been made by many, that Gianpierre's expertise beat them all. As for everyone else, they argued that Gransky was the best medieval architect. It was a very argumentative and passionately split camp. "He's such a jerk," she fumed, covering the ground to her car with long, sure strides. All she'd wanted to do was help him get to Dubai as early as possible, and out of her and Natalia's lives. That wasn't so bad, was it? He'd get what he wanted, and she'd get what she wanted. Correction, she'd get what she needed. The man was insufferable. He was stubborn, obsessive, bullheaded, self-confident to a fault. Charming, endearing, and great with Nathalia, and quickly winning Luciana's heart. She couldn't have it. She couldn't risk setting Nathalia up for that kind of loss so soon after losing her mother. Even if it meant breaking her own heart, she couldn't allow Gianpierre to stay in their lives 1 minute longer than absolutely necessary. She had to get him out as soon as possible, even if that meant going home, packing their bags, and taking her and Nathalia to stay with some distant cousin for the next several weeks until he was gone. That way, she'd at least still have his renter's income. She needed it now that her job was gone. "Luciana!" Gianpierre's voice traveled to her ears from a distance. The strength of his voice as he called for her came and went, and he seemed to be searching rather than actually pursuing her. But it didn't take long for all of that to change, as suddenly his voice rang loud and unobstructed by the walls of the resort. "Luciana!" Throwing a glance over her shoulder, Luciana saw Gianpierre break into a run from the resort's wide-open front doors. But she was a runner, too, and even in high heels, she was able to sprint the distance to her car. Throwing the car's door open, she was inside and starting the engine by the time that Gianpierre reached her. But rather than try to pull her car door back open and beg her not to drive away, he instead leapt onto the hood of her car. There, he stood with legs wide and his hands on his hips. He looked like Superman. All he needed was the big windswept cape, and Luciana couldn't help but roll her eyes in exasperation. He was behaving like an over-emotional teenage boy. She'd just been conducting an interview for Pete's sake, and now she was fired. Quit, she quickly reminded herself. She'd quit. Her life was under her control. Yet, with her car in gear, Luciana hesitated. If she engaged the engine and started to drive, Gianpierre would most likely lose his balance and fall off. He could get hurt. His entire crew, and not just her, would be out of work. Besides that, she cared about him, more than she was willing to say. She didn't want to see him get hurt. Rolling down her window, Luciana stuck her head out and yelled, "Get off my car!" "Hear me out, Luciana, please." "Oh, God," he said, "please." She wanted to hit her forehead against her steering wheel rather than hear him out, but she couldn't. If he had demanded, yelled, or cajoled, she might have risked his well-being by putting the car in reverse and stepping on the gas. He'd have gone tumbling off her car's hood, and she and Nathalia would have been packed and gone before he ever made it home. On the hood, Gianpierre sank to his knees and looked forlornly through the glass of her windshield. But it was when he reached out a palm and pressed it to the glass, as if he were reaching out to touch her heart, that she gave in and turned the car's engine off. Opening her car door, she slid out, closed it, and then stepped to the side of her car's hood. Gianpierre moved to sit on the hood's edge with his legs dangling over the side. Reaching one long arm out, he hooked it around her hips and pulled Luciana into the space between his thighs. "Please don't quit," he whispered, staring at her with eyes as blue as glacier ice. They weren't cold, though. They were worried, with crinkle lines that formed them in an expressive face that had a way of melting all of Luciana's resolve. His hands were warm on her lower back, and she had to fight to keep herself from throwing her arms around his shoulders to be held close against his strong chest. "I didn't quit," she said, recalling the sequence of events. "You fired me." The words came out sounding more petulant than she'd intended. And much faster than she'd imagined it would, her anger slipped away. It didn't seem to matter how hard she wanted to hold on to it. The man's very presence made her inner self happy with a lightness she had never known before he'd come into her life. Gianpierre shook his head. "All of this, the work we do in there. You've grown your job so much, and everything we do all revolves around you now. I couldn't fire you. I could be replaced easier than you." Luciana stiffened and looked away for a long moment before meeting Gianpierre's penetrating gaze again. "I wasn't trying to replace you. She hesitated, "was trying to let you go." "Luciana, I don't want to be let go." He stroked her cheek with his thumb, and it took all of her willpower not to close her eyes and lean her cheek into the cup of his palm. "Why not?" It was a hard question, but she needed to know. "You're leaving anyway. Why not be replaced?" Then, when Gianpierre's expression turned stony and he leaned slightly away from her, she quickly added with a soft voice, "I mean, here at the resort. Not, you know." It would probably be a long, long time before she invited another man into her bed. "I don't want to go." Luciana blinked, unsure of what she was hearing. "I mean," Gianpierre quickly amended, "I don't want to leave this job undone." His words seemed rushed and felt to Luciana as though they were not coming directly from his heart. He was covering how he really felt. There was more to it than he was saying. "I can't have you in Natalia's life anymore," she said. While Gianpierre's words had not been a true reflection of what was going on inside of him, Luciana held nothing back as she let the blunt truth spill from her lips. "What?" Gianpierre's body went still. "She adores you. She might even like you better than me. You and that damn fairy castle that you guys have been obsessing over. It's all you do, every second that you're home and she's awake. But you're going to leave, and all that she'll be left with is a pile of carved styrofoam and other mix-matched supplies. She'll have a thing to remember you by, but she won't have you. She's already been through that, Gianpierre. All she has to remind herself of her mom are some short videos on her mom's old cell phone. She needs more than that. I can come back. Maybe a weekend out of every month," Gianpierre said. "I can video chat with her, and you. We can still—" His words trailed off. "Still what?" she swallowed, feeling unsure of how far she wanted to sink the proverbial knife in. "Still be a family?" It was what they had begun to feel like. A beautiful, amazing, wonderful, happy family. The best she had ever known. "Is that so awful?" he challenged. "No," she shook her head. "But I have to protect her better than that. We can talk to her, explain that I'll be leaving soon. Don't end things yet." He wrapped her in his arms, and Luciana melted against him. He was so strong, so steady. She couldn't believe that they were talking about everything they had ending. "And I can come back and see you both every chance I get." "No," Luciana said with a firm voice as she pushed herself away. I don't want you waltzing in and out of her life whenever it suits you. I won't have her looking forward to your visits just to have you show up less and less." Gianpierre looked pained by her words, but he didn't fight her by offering up a counter-argument. Finally, he nodded. "Okay. Once I go, I'll be gone. But let me stay in Natalia's life, and your life until then." "You're not going to finish the job in time. We're going to have to tape everything off and abandon it as unfinished and unsafe. We need to bring in someone else to finish the job." No. It was Gianpierre's turn for his back to stiffen and for him to declare an impasse. "I will get the job done. We will get the job done. Me, you, and the rest of the crew. I'll hire on additional hands, and we'll work around the clock. We'll get it done on time, Luciana, and if that doesn't work, I'll run the crew from Dubai over video calls. This resort, it's my family's legacy. I can't hand it over to someone else, especially not Gransky. I can't have his stamp on my family's mark for centuries to come. I can't do it." "You'll finish it from Dubai?" Gianpierre nodded. "Which means that I need your help more than ever. You would be my eyes, ears, and compass. I'd leave Paolo behind to lead the crew, and you would be the production manager, making sure all needs are met before anyone even realizes they need anything. I know it's what you're brilliant at. You jumped into this job, found your footing, and then made the job your own. It's what I was coming to talk to you about today when I found you with Gransky." He said the man's name like it left a bad taste in his mouth. Luciana laughed. "You know," she said, dragging the tip of her finger down his chest between the valley of his incredible pecs. "Gransky's just jealous of you. He sees you as the one to beat." "That arrogant blowhard?" Luciana laughed harder. "Mm-hmm. And that's exactly how he feels about you, too." She turned somber. "But we'll do it without him. Me, you, and that insane crew of yours. We'll make this work. If anyone can do it, I know it's you." She said the words despite the heaviness in her heart. Never in her life had she been willing to work so hard to get rid of someone she cared so much about. It was tearing her in two. But in the center of it all sat a little girl who was worth any pain Luciana had to face in order to make things right. 13. Gianpierre. "What is this?" Gianpierre roared as he stormed his way into the courtyard with a pink notification from the local inspections office. "Luciana!" Fat raindrops started to fall from a sky that was already dark with night. Floodlights wired with waterproof extension cords lit the entire center courtyard of the Romano del Mare with the brilliance of day, and instead of his usual crew of 8, no less than 30 people were hard at work. Just as Gianpierre had promised, he and Luciana had put together a round-the-clock crew operating with the sole purpose of finishing the Romano del Mare's inner courtyard before he left for Dubai. It was why he was here. It was what was most important. Another 5 days had ticked past, and now all that he had left was 9 days before he was scheduled to board the plane that would take him away from everything that meant the most to him. He didn't know how he had found himself in this predicament, but he had. He'd woken up one morning to discover that what he'd thought he wanted most, being unequivocally recognized as the best of the best, was no longer that important to him, and that it had not been important to him for some unknown amount of time. It was as if he didn't even need to grieve the letting go of a lifelong dream. It was simply gone, and he was happy. Despite that, nothing had actually changed. He was still leaving, and he was working like a maniac to make it so that he never had to come back. It was why the paper that he held aloft in his clenched fist seemed to burn his skin. "Luciana!" he bellowed for the 5th time. Finally, he saw her trotting toward him as she weaved in and out of equipment and pockets of people. He'd been working her harder than anyone, and if it had not been for the presence of Senora Esposito to make sure all of Natalia's needs were cared for, he was sure that Luciana would have already quit in order to restore her home and family life to a healthy balance. "What? Was the shipment wrong? He swore to me that he had exactly what we were requesting." Luciana turned her attention to punching through windows on the screen of her tablet. "No, this." Gianpierre shoved the offending notice into Luciana's hands. They were refusing to do the final inspection. They want to conduct benchmark inspections throughout the process. They are saying that because we did not get each stage of the repairs approved in advance, that they are refusing the final inspection. All of this. He waved a wide arm to take in the entire courtyard and all the work that was being done. It'll be for nothing. No, Luciana said, snatching the letter out of Gianpierre's hand and straightening the edges of the crumpled paper, her head bent over it to read it. They can't do this. They sent us no notifications of this requirement. You were supposed to be on top of this. I was counting on you. He knew that the accusation wasn't fair. Luciana had become the best project manager he'd ever had, and she had been working harder than anybody, even himself. While he would go home for dinner, rest, and would work with Nathalia to finish the fairy castle, Luciana would still be going through emails, double-checking schedules, handling payroll, and an infinite number of other details he knew he had no comprehension of. He didn't even know when the woman slept, and it was showing. She had dark circles under her eyes. He hated himself for working her so hard, but a part of himself hoped that if he made her crack and the project failed to be completed on time, that she would allow him to continue to oversee the project from Dubai while remaining a part of her and Natalia's life. But she wasn't cracking. She was remaining strong, and he could feel the life that he now craved slipping out of his grasp. I'll take care of this, Jan. I can fix this. Whatever, Gianpierre said, shoving his hands into his pockets and stalking away with his shoulders so tight that they were up around his ears. He wanted to hit something. He wanted to shut the whole renovation down, send everyone home, and come back tomorrow with just his regular crew. Then Luciana. They could set up more proper daycare in one of the more finished suites inside the resort so that Nathalia could be near them all the time. Her laughter in the morning at breakfast had become his favorite part of the day, and Luciana's sweet sighs, after the others had gone to bed, had become his favorite part of the night. He hated that Luciana was willing for all of that to be thrown away. They could still have some of those moments. Sure, it wouldn't be every day, day in and day out, but he would be able to make it back from Dubai often enough to keep everyone feeling connected. What they had didn't have to end. Luciana. No, he can't stay with us. Those words had been the words that Luciana had said to Nathalia the night before when she tucked her into bed, when the little girl had asked if Gianpierre could be her daddy. Doing her best to hide her tears within the dim light of the little girl's room, Luciana had made a silent vow that nothing, absolutely nothing, was going to stand in Gianpierre's way of leaving as soon as possible. That was why Luciana now had on to-die-for red pumps and a body-hugging olive-green dress that looked like a throwback to the go-go dresses of the 60s. Luciana had long legs by nature, but in that dress and with those shoes, she looked as though she had legs long enough to walk on the moon. Flashing her best smile at the young man behind the front counter of the inspector's office and leaning forward a little to let her gold dangling earrings work their mesmerizing charm, she said, "Could I see Signore Barone? It's very important." She batted her eyes. Never before had she been so willing to flaunt what her mother and the Lord above had given her, but she was desperate. Gianpierre had to go. The young man stammered and blushed before disappearing down a hallway. Popping into view a minute later, he waved Luciana to the back office of Signore Barone. A handsome man in his mid-50s, Signore Barone stood and greeted her with a two-handed handshake when she entered the room. "Signorina, what can I do for you?" the silver fox asked, as he motioned her to sit before he sat once more behind his sturdy wood desk. "Signorina Vivaldi," Luciana offered, giving her last name as she smiled warmly at him. Then, she let worry and sadness take over her features and gave a deep, shaky breath. Not wasting any time, she said, "Sir, my job is in jeopardy." She pulled the crumpled pink letter out of her purse. "I oversee the courtyard restoration project at the Romano del Mare, and we received this letter that your office would not perform the inspection needed to conclude the build so that the space could be open to the public." "Ah, yes. Those types of restorations are very complicated, and much of the structural integrity is based on the quality of the foundation elements that are put in place. But as the build continues, those foundation elements tend to get covered up and are no longer visible for inspection. But your office has been aware that this restoration has been ongoing for a couple of months now. Luciana crossed one of her long legs over her knee in a slow movement that had Signore Barone's eyes drifting down to watch. If we had been aware of this stipulation of your office, we would have gladly complied. But as it is, what you are requesting is that we undo much of the restoration work in order to uncover those base elements. If we do that, my boss will walk away from the job unfinished and will not have the property inspected. He will simply fence off the entire section and leave it unavailable to those who visit the resort. Certainly there has to be some way we can work this out. There must be some other inspection technique that could be used. We have kept excellent photographic records of the build's progress at every stage. We could offer those photographs up for inspection, gladly. Signore Barone pursed his lips in thought as he leaned back in his chair and steepled his fingers together. For a man, a good 20 years older than her, Luciana was surprised at how fit and handsome he was. Sicilian men certainly aged with a charming sophistication that seemed to have been left off of the rest of the world's genetic makeup. Signorina Vivaldi, possibly you would be so generous with your time as to let me take you to dinner tonight to talk more about this situation. Then he added quickly, no strings attached, I assure you. Just dinner, some wine, and good conversation. We can, of course, continue to talk about this here and now, but I would find your company delightful in a more relaxed setting. Luciana's gaze shifted to the man's hands. No wedding ring. Gianpierre. She knew in her heart that she couldn't go out to dinner with Signore Barone. Even if what he was offering promised to be innocent, and even if it was the only thing she could do to ensure that she got the inspection of the Romano Donati approved. She'd lied about what Gianpierre would do if the inspection didn't go through. She didn't think that he would close up the restoration and walk away. Too much of his pride was tied up in completing it and doing a job that his family name could rest on for years to come. No, he wouldn't walk away. Well, yes, he would. It's just that he'd come back, and back, and back, waltzing in and out of Luciana's and Natalia's lives and making it impossible for them to move on. She couldn't allow that. She had to stop it from happening, and that meant she had to get that inspection approved. But she couldn't make herself say yes to Signore Barone's invitation, as nice as it was. Someone else was already in her heart, blocking the way to even a dinner out with nice wine and good conversation. Damn you, Gianpierre. He had to go. No, signore. It is a gracious offer, but I can't. The sudden recognition of love had crept up to weave itself into every corner of her heart, leaving Luciana feeling dizzy. How could she have let it happen? She'd always known that Gianpierre was leaving. He had never promised anything less, and he had never said that what they had was a relationship that he wanted to nurture and grow. She was a sidebar or a pastime to him, that was all. But him? He was everything to her after Nathalia. She loved him. Signorina Vivaldi, Signore Barone said, sitting forward in his chair with concern in his eyes. Are you all right? Luciana sat in her chair, doing her best to hold back the tears until finally, shaking her head, she said, No, signore, I'm not. 14. Luciana. Has the specialist called back yet? Paolo called up from 14 feet down in the middle of an enormous pit, destined to become an in-ground pool. Yes, Luciana called back. He'll be here the day after tomorrow to begin work on the wire scaffolding on which the cement mold will be created. Paolo gave her a thumbs up of understanding and then went back to work. Gianpierre was gone, and he had been for over a week. The resort's courtyard was as done as it would ever be for years to come, and Gianpierre was already settled in Dubai. He'd left Paolo behind to follow up on one more project, though, a pool. It would modernize the resort and attract more vacationers. Even with the ocean mere meters away, it was often more convenient and safer to simply swim in a professionally maintained pool, and it was located at its westernmost edge near the cliffs that looked out over the sea. It was the last job that Luciana was scheduled to oversee at the Romano del Mare before needing to find something else. Thankfully, pools were notorious for taking much longer than people thought that they should. So she was still secure in her ongoing employment for at least another 2 months. After that, Paolo would join Gianpierre and the rest of Gianpierre's personal crew in Dubai, and Luciana would have to line up some reliable work with someone else. "Have you heard from him?" They were the words that sat on the tip of her tongue, and she desperately wanted to ask him of Paolo. She herself had driven Gianpierre to the airport the day that he'd left for Dubai. He'd been sweet, and she had stayed cheery and upbeat, but as soon as he'd left, she'd gone to her car and cried. Every day since then, she'd thought that she would hear from him. It was no matter that she'd told him not to call, emphatic that she did not want Nathalia confused. He would be gone, and they would both have to accept it and move on. That's what she'd told him. But she never in a million years thought that he would respect her wishes. She'd imagined that he'd call to tell her goodnight every night, that he would send a delivery boy with oranges for breakfast along with a bouquet of flowers, and that he would promise to be back as soon as he could. But he hadn't done any of those things. None. In fact, she hadn't heard from him at all. Just as she'd asked. So, what right did she have to ask Paolo about him? None. Turning her back to the pool and the crew hired specifically to aid Paolo in its construction, Luciana made her way back toward the resort. She stepped carefully on the inlaid stones that made a winding path down the ground's gentle slope. But the real reason she walked so slow was that her mind was elsewhere. She thought about all the decisions and choices that she'd had to make that had brought her to the moment she was in. She wondered if there was anything that she could have done differently that would have provided some protection to her heart. But she couldn't think of a thing. She'd done it all the best she could. It hadn't been her fault that she'd fallen in love with Gianpierre, and that he hadn't with her. If he didn't love her, then he didn't love her. On that she had no control, just as she'd had no control over what had happened to her sister. With the passage of time, Luciana's survivor's guilt had eased, and now she looked forward to living with a desire to make every day the best that day could be. "Signorina Vivaldi!" called a distant man's voice. Luciana searched the path in front of her for its owner, only to be surprised that it was Signore Barone himself. Luciana hurried forward to meet him, and they kissed on both cheeks in greeting. "Signore Barone, it's wonderful to see you again, but what has brought you out this way?" "Signorina," he said, with his hands on her arms and his brows pinched together. His eyes were, as always, kind and gentle. "I am so sorry. I had nothing to do with this, and I don't know who lodged the complaint, but you must cease construction on the pool right away." "What?" Luciana couldn't believe her ears, and it was with no shame that her mind went to herself first. If the pool's construction was permanently stopped, she'd be out of a job in a matter of days instead of months. She'd done well to be able to cover all of the expenses that had come up so far, but she'd not had enough time to set aside any savings yet. Her and Nathalia were still surviving paycheck to paycheck. Thankfully, Signora Esposito was still Natalia's nanny, and all funds covering her employment came from Gianpierre. He'd insisted, and Luciana had been in no position to refuse. She had to put Natalia's well-being before her own pride. So, at least letting the nanny go was not a conversation that Luciana was going to have. "Signorina, I tried to stop the complaint's impact, but I couldn't." "Who made it?" "I don't know." He pulled a letter out from the inside pocket of his stylish jacket and handed it over. "All I know is that all work must stop until a structural engineer has been brought in to oversee the process." Luciana's mouth dropped open before she exclaimed, "Gransky." "Who?" "It's Gianpierre's main competitor. He's trying to muscle in on Gianpierre's turf now that he's gone." Gianpierre had been so mad when she'd tried to bring him in on the courtyard project. He hadn't trusted the guy 1 ounce, and now she understood why. That underhanded weasel. With the stipulation that the pool's construction could continue with the oversight of a structural engineer, Luciana knew that her job at least still had a chance of being able to continue. That was if Gianpierre would greenlight Gransky coming on board, which of course he wouldn't. Dang it, she thought to herself. She was still out of a job. The drive home was lonely without Gianpierre to keep her company. It was only a 15-minute commute, but somehow the time that had flown by with Gian at her side felt futile and uncomfortable without him. Today, the trip was made even longer because she'd stopped to pick up some of the supplies that Nathalia had sworn she needed. There was glue, fuzzy sticks, molding clay, a rainbow variety of glitter, and 5 different colors of paint. Gian had left Nathalia explicit instructions on how to finish the project without him, and to her credit, she was following them closely and slowly with an intense focus that she hadn't realized the little girl was capable of. With her arms loaded down, Luciana opted to take the elevator to the 4th floor rather than take the stairs. Then a giggle reached her ears the second she stepped through the apartment door. Luciana's smile was instant. She hadn't heard Nathalia laugh like that since Gianpierre had left. That she was managing to find her happiness without him brought a thankfulness to Luciana's heart that had her tiptoeing forward down the entryway so that she could spy on the little girl without interrupting her joy. She was no doubt working on the fairy castle that she and Gianpierre had started. "Look, the drawbridge works backward," a low voice chuckled, and Luciana froze in her tracks. Her heart forgot how to beat, and it took her a second to remind herself to breathe. "It bends down into the water," Gianpierre said, followed by another gale of high-pitched laughter. Luciana leaned forward so that she could peer around the corner to see them, and sure enough, there was Gianpierre, looking like he'd never left. She stepped into view but didn't say anything. It took Gianpierre a moment to notice her, but once he did, his eyes went wide and the color in his cheeks deepened. "I need to go talk to your mama, princess," Gianpierre said, as he leaned forward and kissed her hair. "I heard that she's in need of a structural engineer." He gave Luciana a wink. Looking over her shoulder, Nathalia gave Luciana a happy wave and a gleaming smile before refocusing all of her brain power on the task of making the fairy castle the best it could be. Luciana put her bags down, but she didn't have a chance to utter an under-the-breath question before Gianpierre had her hand in his and was leading her up to the roof. "What are you doing here? Did you stop the pool's build? Was that you?" They were the first words out of Luciana's mouth before the roof's door even closed. But she didn't have time for any others after that because she was in Gianpierre's arms, and his glorious mouth was on hers. Luciana murmured a small sound of complaint, but then gave in, throwing her arms around his neck and arching her chest against his hard body. It didn't just feel good to be enveloped by him again. It felt natural, easy, and good. So good. Finally, Gianpierre pulled far enough away that she was able to talk again, but she was thankful that he kept his arms wrapped around her. She'd missed him so much. "It was me. I had to do it. I'd forgotten something." Luciana's joyful heart deflated, but she stayed as she was in his arms. Even if feeling this again, the strength and comfort of his steady, reassuring presence, was only hers for a moment, she wouldn't throw that moment away. She'd enjoy it with all that she had in her before letting him go again. "What did you forget?" "You." Luciana waited for the qualifier words to come. Those words that would make his simple statement somehow less than the absolute answer that it was. "Well, you and Nathalia," he amended, tipping his head forward to give her another kiss. His scratchy chin was in need of a shave, but Luciana rubbed her chin against his anyway, and let her smile grow until she felt as though she could float away because of how happy she was. But then her smile faltered and gravity became firm on her feet. "How long is your visit?" Gianpierre's arms tightened around her. "Sweet, sweet girl. I am here to stay, if you'll let me. I love you. And I was an idiot, a foolish man chasing a dream that no longer mattered to me. I knew it even before I left, but I had to convince myself that it was true, that I no longer wanted to be the best architect for all the world to see and know. If I am the best architect for this, here, our family, that is enough for me." "Our family," Luciana parroted him as her smile grew again. The words felt right. Gianpierre nodded as he leaned in for another kiss and more kisses between each paused word. "Me, Nathalia, you, and maybe another Nathalia someday, when you're ready." Luciana smiled. We only have 3 bedrooms. With Signora Esposito plus another child, we'd need a 4th. You'd have to build one. For you, I will build fairy castles in the sky. Anything, just as long as it's with you. 15. Gianpierre. Hey, where do you guys keep sneaking off to? Gianpierre called out as he followed Luciana and Nathalia out into the side parking lot of the Romano del Mare. Luciana was doing a slow jog with Natalia's hand in hers as the little girl's legs raced to keep up, occasionally jumping up and down with barely contained excitement. Out ahead of them was the mailman with his bright yellow vest on astride his bright yellow Vespa. The two of them had been sneaking off every day around the same time, and now Gianpierre had at least part of a clue as to why. Ahead of them, the mailman waved some large piece of mail in the air with as much excitement as little Nathalia. He handed it over to Luciana as soon as she reached him, and the 3 of them stared at what she held in her hands. It had been over a month since Gianpierre had made his unexpected and permanent return from Dubai, and while that wasn't very long ago, Gianpierre marveled that Luciana could still manage to surprise him. Even though they had only been in each other's lives for 3.5 months, he felt as though he'd known her for a lifetime, and he had long since lost the ability to imagine any kind of future that wasn't centered around them. He was going to start an online school for structural engineering specializing in medieval architecture. The degree would require a finishing year of hands-on study with him or another approved instructor, working on the actual restoration of a medieval building. Making that shift from year-round fieldsman to spending at least part of his time in the classroom would allow him to be a hands-on dad for Nathalia. He would rarely miss a dinner or a breakfast with his family. As for Luciana, she had plans of her own. She was opening an art gallery and a small medieval museum, both to be housed within the Romano del Mare. They would provide an additional draw for tourists, and Luciana would be able to continue to utilize her exceptional project management skills at a location only minutes from home. Little Nathalia would always have one of her parents nearby, ready to come running at a moment's notice. There would be no more bad dreams of loss. There would only be fond memories of all the love she'd ever been given from every parent she'd ever known. It was a better life than Gianpierre had ever imagined he could have, and it was with the 2 most beautiful girls in the world, even if they were keeping a secret from him. Breaking into a jog in order to catch up and find out what their tete-a-tete was about, he quickly dropped back down to a walk when Luciana and Nathalia turned and ran at him as fast as Natalia's legs would go as the mailman rode away. "What's going on?" he asked, throwing his arms wide as he slowed to a full stop. But stopping did him no good because Luciana and Nathalia continued toward him at full speed. Luciana reached him first, jumping through the air to tackle him when she was still several feet away. Falling to the side of the parking lot onto grass, they landed with a thud and then were joined by a leaping and then crawling Nathalia as she climbed her way to the top of the heap. "What's going on?" Gianpierre asked again, this time laughing uncontrollably. "This," Luciana squirmed until she was able to lift her hands and what she had in them above her head. Shifting so that she fell off Gianpierre and landed with her back on the ground and her head on his shoulder, she held the latest copy of Architectural Digest aloft. Nathalia took up her spot lying on Gianpierre's chest and peered up at the magazine as well. It was the magazine on which Gianpierre would have graced the cover if he had remained on the Dubai job. Luciana flipped through the magazine's pages until she reached the center fold, and there, in full color, from one edge of the page to the other, was a picture of Gianpierre's and Natalia's fairy castle, and both of their pictures in small circles near the bottom. "What?" Gianpierre grabbed the magazine, not believing his eyes. "You didn't? How did you do this? Luciana, you didn't visit them in one of your tight dresses, did you?" "No," Luciana laughed. "We mailed them a picture of the castle, and everything else that happened from there was all them." She turned on her side so that she could look up into Gianpierre's face. "They've asked to be notified when you get done with the renovations on the Romano del Mare. I know that there are still some spots to be perfected. They're going to do a travel edition, and they want to consider the resort for the cover." Gianpierre was speechless as he stared down into Luciana's lustrous green eyes. Then he stretched his neck back so that he could look behind him at the resort. All this time, all his traveling, and all of his fighting against working and staying in Sicily, and it turned out that everything he'd ever wanted was right here. In fact, there was nowhere else for him. He was home, pure and simple. From the very first day that Luciana had walked into his life, everything he thought he'd known about what he wanted irrevocably changed. It had just taken him a while to understand that. It was a shift that Luciana had been able to make in the blink of an eye when her sister passed away and she went from aunt to mother. Silly him. It had taken a little longer than a blink for him to realize that his home was with the two best girls in the world, the ones laying right in his arms. They were his present and his future. Fame, accolades, and prestige couldn't compare. Luciana and Nathalia. They were his forever. End of Italian Billionaire's Unexpected Lover, the Romano Brothers series, Book 2. Thank you for listening. This has been Italian Billionaire's Unexpected Lover, the Romano Brothers series, Book 2. Written by Leslie North. Performed by Connor Brown. Copyright 2018 by Relay Publishing. Production copyright 2018 by Relay Publishing.